You can go.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, also known as GIFT, welcome to today's conference on One Belt, One Road. What's next in the new multipolar world order? Today is the first installment of our three-part conference series called Shattering Paradigms, China in the World. My name is Liana from GIFT, and I will be your MC today. We have brought together an exciting mix of renowned and highly respected international professors, thought leaders, and geopolitical strategists. The moderated discussion will no doubt be intellectually robust, constructive, and well balanced. Our belief is that this conference will not only give you the latest insights, but they will be insights that go beyond common narratives that are not covered by mainstream media. The objectives are to bring context and clarity and to dispel misconceptions. We will start with opening remarks from GIFT's founder and CEO, Chandran Nair. In line with the conference ethos, he have a new book out in September this year called Understanding China: Governance, Socioeconomics, Global Influence, which offers a long overdue perspective on China's transformation that is balanced and objective. Chandran will kick off and moderate the much anticipated panel one, From Vision to Reality, Taking Stock of Belt and Road Initiative. For this panel, we are delighted to have Professor Wang, Deputy Dean of the Institute of New Structural Economics at Peking University, Mustafa Hyder, Executive Director at the Pakistan-China Institute, and Professor Efem Ubi, Professor of International Relations, Strategic Studies, and China-Africa Studies, and Director of Studies at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. If you have any questions for our panelists or the moderator, please don't forget to ask them through the Q&A box below. This first panel will set the stage for our second panel to discuss Charting the Future Path, What's Next for the BRI, at around 5:15 p.m. And then at
I
6,
am already in there.
we will
Yes, I've
have the
joined you.
long-awaited closing keynote by esteemed expert Professor Rana Mitter, SD Lee Chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, moderated by Chandran. For the full rundown and speaker profiles, please refer to our conference website. The link will be shared in the chat window. This conference is being recorded, and the full video recordings will be uploaded onto the conference website and GIFT's YouTube channel. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Chandran. He will give his opening remarks to kick off the first discussion for today. Over to you, Chandran.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liana, and a good day to everyone from all over the world. Welcome to this first panel, From Vision to Reality, Taking Stock of the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it's pretty clear what we're trying to discuss. But let me try and put a bit of context to all of this as well. I know we have people from Africa, Europe, across Asia, China, India, Southeast Asia, Europeans, etc., joining this. And the context is really important to what the objectives are. So the objectives of this are to create common understanding, people-to-people diplomacy. But in that mind, we are extremely grateful that we are doing this supported by the Office of the Commissioner's Office, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Area. So we are doing this with one purpose in mind. We live in a very fractured, fragmented world, so much misunderstanding. And one good place to start is to essentially have people-to-people diplomacy. You'll all be surprised to think, well, that's happening all the time, but you might also be interested to know it's actually not that often. We are inundated with information, quite often driven by ideology from whichever side of the world we belong in, what type of government, what type of worldview, the geopolitics, etc. But there's not much people-to-people diplomacy and getting open opinions from people who are scholarly, who have no axe to grind, and are free to say what they want to say about the areas they come from, and perspectives that are quite often ignored, dare I say, in the mainstream. So that's really the context. The Belt and Road Initiative that many of you will be aware of was initiated I believe, in 2013. In 2013, it became the cornerstone of the Chinese foreign policy, a policy that essentially recognized that as China developed, it also had greater global responsibilities. And as it developed, it would have to impact the world in ways that it could be seen as having contributed to a global good. This was the whole basis of the One Belt, One Road initiative. That then became known as the BRI, and since then, the number of countries. I've just got some data here. In 2024, there are 140 members of the initiative. 50% of the world's GDP and 75%, which constitutes 75% of the world's population. The Belt and Road Initiative then resulted in the formation of the AIB, the Asia Investment Bank out of Beijing, Infrastructure Investment Bank out of Beijing, which was created in 2016 to help facilitate all of this. And numerous studies, including that by the World Bank, have made it very clear that the initiative would essentially help with trade flows. And some estimates say that up to 115 countries would benefit from the trade flows that would be triggered and improved by the initiative. So this is some of the background to the Belt and Road Initiative. The question now is, and which is what hopefully this panel will enlighten us on, is let's take stock. Has it achieved what it was meant to do? It clearly triggered a lot of geopolitical tensions. If you look back at the last 15, 20 years and carefully look at the place we are in today with geopolitical tensions, particularly between China and the rest of the world, but you might also state between the dominant Western world and the emerging new multipolar world, it's an all-time high. And many of us who look back would thought, never have imagined that this would have happened. And part of this is essentially the rise of the rest of the world, China spearheading that, but also having to navigate a complex shifting order in which other countries have very different aspirations. So has the BRI served its purpose? Is it has it achieved some of the aspirations that China set out to do? How has it contributed to the economic development goals? That's part of the discussions this afternoon. So I'm very, very pleased that we have. I'm joined today with three extremely distinguished panelists who come from, as you can all clearly see, from very different parts of the world, who will share with us their viewpoints on this question. So where is the BRI going? Let's take stock. Is it all that we're hearing about it, that's either pro or con? What is actually happening? And many people may not fully understand or appreciate its impacts. So as Liana, my colleague, said, we first have a very distinguished Professor Yong from China. And then I'm very pleased that we have Mr. Mustafa Saeed from Pakistan. And very importantly as well, Professor Efem from Nigeria. So let me start by inviting the first speaker, to Professor Wang, who has written many books, is a specialist in macroeconomics, has also looked into, studied the economies of China and India, and spent his adult life really researching these issues. So before I invite Professor to say a few words, let me also remind the audience, please send us your questions. We're already getting a few, and then we'll try and interact. So Professor, over to you, your view on the Belt and Road, taking stock. Has it achieved what it set out to do? Has it created a world that is more harmonized? Has it splintered the world? Has the geopolitics worsened because of it? But let's look at the economic facts, and that's where I believe you can bring us some clarity for the international audience. So take 3 to 5 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nair. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to share the views with the other experts and the audience. So briefly, let me introduce myself a little bit more. I'm a professor of economics from the Institute of New Structural Economics at Peking University. And so I think for the Belt and Road Initiative, my overall view is that I think it is a kind of a new model of South-South cooperation. It initiate has like 5 areas for international cooperation, right? Infrastructure connectivity. The second one, policy communications, and third one is trade links, and the fourth one is financial cooperation, and last one the cultural exchanges. So I'm an economist, so I think from the infrastructure connectivity and trade links point of view, I think over the past 10 years, I think Belt and Road Initiative achieved a lot. For example, from 2013 up to December 2023, so China itself has invested more than around $1 trillion in infrastructure investment alone in Belt and Road countries, and more than 70% of them of those infrastructure investment are on trade and energy and the transportation, this infrastructure. So I think infrastructure connectivity is crucial for developing countries like many in those Belt and Road countries. And I do think data shows that the trade links among the BNR and countries also increase. In particular, the trade link between China and other BNR countries are significantly increased. So overall, I think it is achieving what most of the countries, all countries want, but still there it also encounters some difficulties and challenges. But I'm quite confident that this is a kind of right thing to do, and I'm thinking that perhaps through many kind of try and error process and also multilateral discussions, corporations, the BNR initiatives will be successful and helping all the developing countries to grow. By the way, in today's world, 85% of the total population is still living in developing country, including mainland China. And when China started its economic reform in 1978, its per capita GDP was less than 1/3 of that in Sub-Sahara Africa region. So China was very, very poor. But last year, China's per capita GDP is already over 13,000 US dollars. So I think what China's experience could be useful for other developing countries in terms of how to grow from a low-income country to middle income and finally to high income. Let me just stop here. Thank you, Nair.
Professor Wang, thank you so much. I'm going to just ask you one point that you made that I think, before we go to the next speaker. I mean, you talked about the 5 areas, right?
Right.
Information, infrastructure, policy, trade, culture. And what's the 5th one?
So policy, cultural exchanges.
Cultural exchanges. Could you just spend a minute just saying a bit more about why? I mean, infrastructure we understand. Trade we understand, and you've talked about it, but policy, culture, and the 5th one was
financial cooperation.
Financial cooperation. I can understand the financial cooperation, but why was the culture and policy also important? If you could just give us a bit of insight into that.
Sure. So I think different countries clearly have different cultures, different histories, and have different policies, and including the policy implementations are also different. I think one big obstacle for South-South cooperation and all the development of all the developing country is kind of lack of communications, effective communications in all these areas and exchanges. People do not fully understand each other. So That's why I think policy communications and the cultural exchanges are super important. And even sometimes you have goodwill for trade and also like for investment. But if people do not really understand the culture and the history of the partner, sometimes it would have very bad consequences. So we could list many examples. So that's why I think the cultural exchanges and the policy communications are a very crucial part of the Belt and Road Initiative. There.
Thank you,
Ms. Nair.
Professor
Yeah.
Yong. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So Mustafa Saeed, welcome. I understand you're in Pakistan today, and you're the executive director of the Pakistan-China Institute. Mr. Saeed, for the audience, it's a distinguished career in both all the policy areas, but also a track record of doing a lot of work in the environmental space. I won't go into all the details, but I think you can cover it. I mean, Pakistan is a very important country, as we all understand, critical in the whole sort of transformation of the region, the Silk Road, etc. What is your view about the experience that Pakistan has in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative? And also, if you could just touch on some of the reports one sees quite often about the impact it has, the debt trap, and all of those things. So over to you, and take 3 to 5 minutes to please give us an insight about what's happening and how it's viewed in Pakistan, which I think a lot of people underestimate its importance in the greater scheme of things of development. Yeah.
Percy, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in this stimulating conversation, very timely, important topic. As you know, Pakistan was the flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative when it was initiated in 2013. And it was Mr. Wang, state councillor, then foreign minister, termed it as a pilot project of the Belt and Road Initiative, then later flagship project. And Pakistan has received tentatively $32 billion of investment and ongoing as we speak. And, from a global South perspective, a country which is usually dependent on multilateral institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, unlocking access to finance was a tremendous opportunity for Pakistan and others alike. And this was a no strings attached opportunity for Pakistan. And when 2013 happened and the Belt and Road MOU was signed between the governments, Pakistan had a major energy crisis. We used to have electricity shutdowns, industries used to shut down, diesel generators were used by houses, by affluent households who could afford it. Those who couldn't used to have blackouts because there was a 4,000 to 5,000 megawatt shortfall in the demand and the installed capacity. So what immediately and initially the BRI investments did were to bridge that 4,500, 5,000 megawatts by investment in Pakistan's energy sector, in the power sector. And these were very successful investments, I would say. So that happened. And then Gwadar Port is a port which some of you may know of. It's in Balochistan. It was a port which was with the Singapore Port Authority in the past, which had not really developed it, but had signed a contract with the government of Pakistan. When the China Overseas Port Holding Company signed the lease agreement for 40 years, now we have 2 industrial zones there. The largest airport of Pakistan is there, and A380 can land there. And Balochistan is the lesser developed part of Pakistan, and it's a poor part of Pakistan, I would say. So there was this huge investment in Gwadar Port. And I want to make a key point, and I think it's important for the moderator to know this. When you talk about debt, now the Gwadar Airport is not an investment and it's not a loan. It's a grant of about $250 million, right? So when we talk about the Belt and Road investments, we can't talk in a monolithic sort of narrative. You can't paint everything with the same brush. There might be some which are soft loans. There's some which might be commercial loans. There's some investments, and there are also grants. So we have to really have a very nuanced perspective and talk very specifically when we talk about Belt and Road investments. Similarly, I want to tell you about the power investments that happened, the power projects. There were some fossil fuel investments, there were some wind power projects, there were solar power projects, and there were hydropower projects, right? So there's a 80% debt financing usually, and the debt is by the sponsor of the project, which is the Chinese investor, okay, which it borrows money from the China Exim Bank or the China Development Bank. And then about 15 to 20%. So 75 to 80% is debt financing, and then about 15, 20% is equity, also by the Chinese investor. And that's how the power, and then there's, of course, a power purchase contract with the government of Pakistan, which is about 30 years, 40 years. In Pakistan's 30 years, that Pakistan's Central Power Purchasing Agency will purchase electricity produced by the Chinese investor for the next 30 years. And similarly, we had major road projects. There's a Sakhar to Multan road project, about $3.5 billion project. That was a fusion of commercial and soft loans. So it was definitely a significant influx of investment in a country which was not familiar or used to or had experienced such large-scale investment in the past by any country. And it impacted the connectivity very well. And I want to share a report that we just published. I'm a co-author, Dr. Rafiq Dosani from the RAND Corporation in the United States, head of the Asia Pacific wing of RAND. And myself and my colleague Umar, we've co-authored this report on how this Sakhar to Multan motorway has impacted tourism and religious tourism, because there's Sufi shrines along this route within Pakistan. And the results, we did primary research and we visited these places. It's tremendous. Because people in Pakistan got mobility and access to visit these shrines. So it has stimulated local economy. But what has happened, if I may, and I might be exceeding time, is that the BRI has evolved.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So the BRI has evolved, and I think it's very important to understand. And how it has evolved is that when it began, China's economy was much stronger. It was much more, the GDP growth was 11, 12, 13%. It was higher. So China was more bullish. President Xi had just taken over as the president and general secretary of the Communist Party. And the global international competition had not accelerated to the extent that it has right now. And these investments were taking place. They were big ticket items, and they were SOE-led investments. Now, as the first decade of the Belt and Road has ended, and there was COVID in between, a big pandemic which affected everything, that bullishness is diluted. And Sinosure, which underwrites projects and financing for outbound investments, is much more prudent and cautionary, which means that the investments are now smaller scale, much more due diligence is taking place, and China is much more selective than it was in the past. And the SOEs are investing within China to stimulate China's economy as per President Xi's dual circulation directive, as opposed to investing outbound. So there's more private sector-led investment in the BRI from SOE. So that's one change. Second, the scale and magnitude of the investment has reduced. And third, they are much more prudent and less bullish. So I think these are three changes which has happened. And the fourth is greener investments, as China under President Xi takes a key role in climate change, championing climate change. So they're greener, more mindful and cognizant of how high in carbon or lack thereof those investments are.
Syed, Mr. Syed, thank you. A wonderful exploration. I think I know some stuff, but you gave in 3-4 minutes some nuggets of information that are absolutely, I think, why we have these conversations, because we don't understand around the world, especially Pakistan is only in the news quite often for the wrong things. It's a negative perspective, etc. So can I ask you just one point? And I was very pleased that you mentioned the power sector, the port, the airport, etc. Can you just give us a hint of, I don't know if you have any data, etc., but and you can't attribute any changes in the macroeconomic situation to the BRI, but maybe there's some data because you alluded to research you have done with the road. But particularly looking at energy and power, and we all know what blackouts used to be and all of that. How has that been a real transformation in Pakistan? And therefore, in terms of quality of life or GDP, any quantification that you can give us in terms of what percentage of the population now have access to reliable electricity supply or something like that, that'd be very useful as well, because I learned a lot from your 5 minutes of, very specific things that people might not know. And I think I know, I tried to observe what's happening in Pakistan, but your insights were very useful. So I'm greedy for a bit more detail.
With pleasure, and thank you so much for your kind words of appreciation. So about 7,000 to 8,000 megawatts approximately have been added. So we have excess capacity now by these investments. And while I don't have the figure of how many people now have access to electricity compared to in the past, but this access to electricity includes both urban areas and rural areas.
Okay.
Because the lack of access to electricity included and transcended to urban centers. And when you talk about access to electricity, I'm referring to both domestic consumers and industrial consumers. Some factories at that time, I remember, had actually migrated to Bangladesh, had relocated to Bangladesh because of the electricity problem. And these power projects have given rise to and birth to industrial zones for companies to come back and relocate and have joint ventures with Chinese companies. So it was definitely a very major change to Pakistan's business environment. And during the 2013 to 2018 period, our GDP was between 3.8 to about, I think, 4.7 or 4.6, almost touching 5%, which is relatively high for Pakistan. So that time, and the Moody's had given us I think a B plus or a rating at that time. So you can see what had happened. And right before that, if I remember, there was a Newsweek cover page in 2012 or 2011, just before the BRI investments took place, and it said that the most dangerous country in the world is not Iraq, it is Pakistan. And then these investments took place, and it sort of changed the game for Pakistan and made it strategically relevant as well, put it back on the radar for investors.
Great to know. And by the way, I asked the question about debt so that you could essentially make the point you made, so that you could have, because all the time we hear, in mainstream media, these are all debt traps, etc. So thank you for, responding.
Just one thing, when you talk about debt, I have written a paper with the professor from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore on which was published in Singapore in the university. Where is the money going? It's on CPEC, and at that time there was a lot of talk of debt as well. So it's compared multilateral institutions' debt and debt from China, and sort of try to dissect it.
Yes, that's a good one. So please send us a link if you can to the paper, and people can access it. It's a very good comparison when people look at those. So that is a nice way to now go and switch to Africa. As they say, if you want to talk about Africa, you should start in Nigeria. And when I'm a South African, I say you have to start in South Africa. But Professor Ubi, great pleasure to have you on here. And you're very distinguished a professor of international relations. I think you have several degrees, and you're also a visiting professor at many other universities, including Zhejiang University in China. The same question to you. How does it look like from Africa? Has the BRI been achieved its goals? Both Professor Yong and Mr. Said reflected from the positions what it achieved to do. Mr. Said talked about what it achieved in Pakistan. How does it feel like, and what is your assessment of progress to date? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Nair, for having me on this auspicious meeting. And I'm glad, to bring greetings from the NI, Nigerian of International Affairs, where I work as a director of studies. And this particular meeting, it's one meeting that is supposed to give credence to what China is doing in Africa. I would say that the BRI is achieving its purpose. I've written some articles that talked about the BRI, a focus on Nigeria and a focus on Africa, where I've argued that I think Africa should not lose sight of the BRI, or Africa should not lose sight of its cooperation with China, because if you look at the history of countries in Africa, right from the period of colonialism, or even prior to that period, you find out that Africa has always been on the receiving side. Now, if you come down to Africa and you look at all the infrastructures that were built in Africa, they were built by the countries that colonized Africa, from area of raw material, or source of raw material to the ports. But with the BRI, a lot has changed since 2000, when Africa started engaging China. A lot has changed, and there are a lot of infrastructural footprints in Africa. I have also gone around some part of Africa to understudy the BRI project, like the Mombasa Railway, where it was being built, which has been completed. I was there. These are high-tech infrastructure that the Chinese have actually given to Africa. Now, if you come to the eastern part of Africa, where Mombasa is also, the Djibouti rail line, up to Ethiopia, and the Sudanese rail line up to, linking East Africa. Those ones, a lot of them have been completed. If you come to Nigeria, I must say that a lot too has been completed in Nigeria, like the Kaduna Abuja rail line, the light rail, which is the mass urban transit. If you come to Lagos, you see the Lagos Ibadan rail line. In fact, other infrastructure are in discussion. So I would like to say that the BRI is achieving a lot, but there's more to be done. And Africa has to engage China in a proper way, such that whatever the promise is, that can be fulfilled. Like I said in most forum, when I discuss, is that, you see, it is one thing to promise and another to fulfill that promise. Now, but I would like to say the challenge is the mainstream media, especially from the West, which has come up with the issues of debt trap, how Chinese loans to Africa, in terms of the contract with China, when they're signing this contract, focus on debt trap, alleged there's an alleged ceding of infrastructure and sovereignty to China if the country cannot repay those loans. These accusations and concerns are Western propaganda, as far as that is what we see in Africa, to undermine the unprecedented relationship between Africa and China. On the contrary, I would say that such uninformed debates stem from skeptics and xenophobes, based on the lack of information, misinformation and disinformation. Now, what I mean by lack of information is the fact that, you see, a lot of relationship agreements between China and Africa, they are shrouded in secrecy. We don't have data as much as you have data, especially when you're in China, the data are often not there. So a lot of people act based on what the media has now. And, the propaganda is huge. Propaganda is huge in this part of the world. So there is always the problem of misinformation. So this situation in itself relates to the dissemination of incorrect or misleading information. This also further leads to disinformation, a situation in which false information is deliberately and often covertly spread to influence public opinion. And so that is why you see a lot of some scholars, talking about the debt trap in Africa. Some are blaming China for a whole lot. If you look at the mass media and the social media, you see the discourse on the recolonization of Africa, China is supporting rogue state and all that. But this whole thing actually marks the beginning of the debt trap discourse. But, from research, over the years that I've done, I think this is a myth. This is not real. This is not something that is actually what is on the ground. Because when you come on the ground, you're seeing this infrastructure. And like my government will always tell you, China is the only willing partner who want to invest in Africa where other partners have refused to invest. Because if you look at after colonialism, no new infrastructure, whether it's from the West, from our former, or from the British who colonized us, you can't see anything new. And what China has come to do now is to upgrade those infrastructures and actually begin to build new ones. For instance, we have the coastal rail line that will run from Lagos up to Calabar. We're also talking about the Mambila power station, which the Chinese, in fact, as I speak to you, my government has just signed another new contract with China for about 2 something billion, million, I think 2 something billion or so, if I'm correct, loan for to build rail lines from Port Harcourt to Maiduguri and all that. So I think with this, when you come on the ground, there's no point to argue that China BRI is not working. It is, and there's a lot of prospect if we're able to manage the relationship well, and if we avoid media propaganda. I think we need to, right now, Africa does not need propaganda. Africa needs to see what is on the ground. We are looking for development. And so for me, I would say that it is high time the West and the Chinese government cooperate for the global South development and for Africa's development. That is what we are looking for. If you are following the discussion globally now, Africa is actually moving towards a new global governance because the present governance system is already in disorder. There's chaos everywhere, there's uncertainty everywhere. And Africa is asking for a new multilateral system, a new multipolar system that is different from the existing one. And so I think if we are able to come together as developing countries in concerted effort under collectivization, we have a way, to be able to push Africa forward and push the global South forward in terms of how we engage each other. I think the future is collectivization, where the groupings of developing countries will come together and see how they can push their development further and create an inclusive development that is anti-disparity, that is based on equity and justice.
Thank you, Professor. That incredible insights. I lived in Africa for 4 or 5 years, so I have a flavor of what you're saying. I think a lot of us who are not that familiar with Africa forget the scale of the continent, the levels of deprivation that were left behind after the colonial era, and all the things that you talked about, the infrastructure was built mainly to take raw materials to ports, and now something else is different. I have one question for you, which I thought, you said something which got me thinking, and I hope you might elaborate. You said something that African countries need to get better at engaging with China in a proper way.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in what you meant, because I think quite often when I meet people who say, if I'm speaking in Europe, China's the new colonizer, etc., my typical response is, well, the Chinese haven't gone with guns and priests. But they're making deals. They could be slightly unfair deals, etc., and that should be incumbent on African governments to get better deals, etc. But they're not putting a gun to your head and saying, do this or else, or taking the raw materials. So I'm keen to get your perspective on what should, after all, China is a powerful nation, etc. And there is no running away that when you're more powerful, you have more clout, even in fair negotiations. So what is it that African countries that should do better in engaging with China?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think quite an impressive question. Over the years, I've realized that many African countries, when they go to international fora, they hardly negotiate for what will guarantee mutual benefit, and but much more importantly, many African countries do not have policy of engagement with
Yes.
the powers, with the advanced countries or economically developed countries. They don't have any policy of engagement. For instance, you could see that there's a China-Africa policy. And so all engagement between China and Africa will revolve on that, whether it's with individual countries, it will revolve on that policy. Now there's a US-Africa policy, there's UK-Africa policy, there's EU-Africa policy. And what I have not seen is, maybe except for South Africa, is maybe a Nigerian-US policy or a Nigerian-China policy. I think this is where we have to begin from. Because if you have a policy of engagement, written down, in terms, so you'll be able at any particular time in a meeting, what you want. So our foreign policy should be deliberate, So when you go to sit with the Chinese or you sit with the American, you know what you want at any particular time. I think that's where we begin from. Now, the next point I raised was the issue which I talked about is the issue of promise and fulfilling that promise.
Yes.
So if you even look at the FOCAC documents, the FOCAC document is heavily pregnant with a lot of promises, including technology transfer, including fight for peace and against insecurity. All of that should be something that should be pragmatic. But how do we go about that? I think we have to sit down again and look at the issues that individual African countries needs, and how to go about it. I understand, and which I quite agree with you, Professor, that you see the Chinese don't use guns or don't put guns on your head, and they negotiate with you. It is what you have agreed with that they come out with. I have told people the Chinese will never come and enforce anything. They have to negotiate with you. But one area too that the Chinese will have to, maybe in the nearest future, be more pragmatic and engage the African countries is in the area of peace and security, which is ravaging the continent, especially the Sahel. From my study, I realized that the Chinese prefer, in terms with issues related to peace and security, they prefer to engage with the multilateral organizations like the African Union, the Economic Community of West African States. But where the hotspots of this insecurity, those countries, the Chinese are actually not engaging directly with them. So I think that has to change. With the issue of infrastructure, I wouldn't subscribe to coming to Africa to build social infrastructures like the presidential palaces, Well, you can do social corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility. But when it comes to we need productive infrastructure. If we have productive infrastructures, we can actually begin. That's actually the foundation for development, the takeoff of Africa's development. A lot of African countries are not industrialized, and like we ask ourselves, scholars in Africa, we keep 60 years after independence, over 60 years, why has Africa not moved forward? Why have we not been able to industrialize? Is it that the sciences we are taught here is different from the sciences that are being taught in China or taught in America? I think the foundation of science is the same everywhere. So why are we suppressed? Why are we being suppressed to disallow that takeoff of industrialization? Now, another thing that the Chinese have to do differently is that they should begin to outsource and offshore some part of their enterprises, which is also part of the FOCAC agreement. They don't have to treat us the same way we were treated under colonialism and after colonialism, post-colonial period, where you just come, take the raw materials and take it to Africa and produce goods and now bring it back as finished goods and sell it to us at an exorbitant price. We need that to change. So for instance, if you go to Ethiopia, the shoe industry, which is one of the most the biggest shoe industry in the world in Zhejiang province, they have outsourced some of the part of the company to Ethiopia. Now, other places where there are other places where they have outsourced some of their companies. So I think many of these companies too should begin to outsource to Africa. There's nothing bad if the companies come to Africa and Nigeria and produce maybe a pen and say made in Nigeria. It's still, it gives us credibility.
Yes.
It shows that the relationship is mutual, the relationship is moving forward. So BRI should take into consideration those aspects of the relationship. Yes, it's not just about cultural exchange or people-to-people exchange, financial integration. So it should go beyond that and not just infrastructure. Because the infrastructure can be there if the companies, the industries are not there. Of what purpose is the infrastructure? The infrastructure, if it is road, the rail line, is supposed to move market and all that, and for export too.
Thank you, Professor. That's wonderful. I really appreciate also you bringing into focus the issue of how does China through the BRI also get involved, and this is the touchy issue with regard to peace and security through development, and I'd like to hear more. So this is a nice way for me to bring back Professor Wang. Professor, you've heard someone from Pakistan talk about these issues. You've heard someone from Nigeria talk about these issues, etc. I'm sure people are thinking, what does Professor Wang think about all of this from a Chinese perspective and a serious academic who has looked at all of this? So over to you to just respond to what we've heard in the last 15, 20 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Nair. So there is old Chinese saying, which is that if you want to get rich, build road first. I think for developing countries, industrialization is not only just a good way, but I think it is a unique way to escape the low-income trap, to escape the middle-income trap. So, initially, the infrastructure is public good. So I think the China's National Development Bank and all SOEs can take the lead and invest a lot. It's a kind of public investment. Hopefully, that will help crowd in private investment, both in host countries and also from China. So I do see, once you have those electricity, have the roads, and then, both, the private firms in the Belt and Road countries and Chinese private firms would have incentive to do business, to establish the plans and so on and so forth. So infrastructure investment is the first step. I think it is a key step. And this is China's secret. I think this is also something that could be really crucial for developing countries. So this is the first thing. And the second thing, I think it is not just Belt and Road Initiative, it's a cooperation. It's not just about the capital flow. It's not just about trade flow. It's not just about technology flow, but also it's about idea flow. How to get the development strategy correct. I'm very proud to have some international students from all the BRI countries. So, in Peking University, there is an institute called Institute of South-South cooperation and development. I have the privilege to supervise several PhD students from BNR countries, including one Pakistan student whose name is Urfa Iqbal, and her dissertation is about
She's a good friend of
China.
mine.
Yeah, okay, great. So China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, so CPEC. So it is a single sort of a project. It has a high target, but so far, honestly speaking, it has not achieved its full potential. So how to make it more effective? This is exactly what her book is about. I think this idea flow is crucial. And I think so many people might be interested in how is the kind of BNI strategy different from the old sort of, how the Western countries help developing countries. From my observation, I think one key difference is that the key words are different. So in Western countries, they are also philanthropists. They also want to really help Africa, for example. But the key word in their mind is human capital. That is health and education. Okay, and so they spend a lot of money to help improve the health and improve education, to increase the human capital. This is certainly correct. This is a noble thing to do. But there's still gap between having human capital and industrialization. What is the key word from China's strategy? Job. So because China's development stage is closer to other BNI countries. China started as a very, very poor country, even poorer than South Sahara region. So there are a lot of labor-intensive industries, these traditional industries, and they are now gradually, losing the comparative advantage in China because the wage go up. But these industries are particularly very consistent with comparative advantage of many developing countries. So I do see some Chinese private entrepreneurs who in the apparel industries and the garment industry, they move their business to Ethiopia, to many developing countries. And why? Because these entrepreneurs, they know the technology, they know the world of marketing, they know how to manage a firm. But these traditional industries have already disappeared in United States for decades. Okay, so for China, it's a mutually beneficial thing. So once the infrastructure are there in Belt and Road countries now, and the labor-intensive industries are typically considered with a comparative advantage because they are low-income countries. So that really help engage this effective foreign direct investment, and also consistent with the comparative advantage and determined by the factor endowment structure in the developing countries. So that really is an effective way to achieve industrialization. This is exactly what China did. Okay, so I think and this job is important. So long the workers in the African countries, you have enough skills to work in that factory. You do not really need to have a formal degree or college degree, but so long as your skills are really in a match, and then after a certain time of training, I think African people are good people. They quickly learn. So and then they just so jobs. Once you have jobs, then you have revenues, then you have tax revenues, then you have more public goods infrastructure, and then this is a virtual cycle. So I think this key idea is very different. So and from new structural economic point of view, so how to really achieve economic development for a developing country? We should start from what we have, our endowment structure, and to see what industries are considered with a comparative advantage, and then we let the market do the job and also have facilitating state, then gradually work. But the mainstream Western style sort of this prescription is opposite. They would give advice to the developing country like this. Look at what you do not have. Look at what rich country have, and use a rich country as a benchmark. And now look at you. Your lack of technology, your lack of modern industry, your lack of modern education, your lack of modern financial industry, your lack of rule of law. You lack everything. How to do it? Just make up. Do exactly what we do. This is wrong. You have goodwill, but it's not effective. New structural economics or Chinese experience tell you should start from what you have. Based on what you have, you are a 5-year-old kid and now you got sick. So what is your benchmark model? Your benchmark model should be a 5-year healthy kid instead of 25-year healthy adult. So you really need to look at your own development strategy. Yeah. What is your comparative advantage? And once your industries develop and following comparative advantage, and then accumulate capital faster, and when the endowment structure gradually also upgrade, right? So your capital accumulate, a rate price of capital goes down, and the industry is going to also upgrade to more and more capital intensive, to more and more skill intensive, and then you are on the right track. So I think these are the key methodological difference, approach difference. And I think that is what the Belt and Road initiative, how that differ from old traditional way, which have already been proven wrong by history. Let me just stop here.
Professor Yong, absolutely brilliant intervention. I could see Professor Ubi nodding. I could see Mr. Syed also in agreement. I think you brought some great wisdom there. Particularly the thing that is, as you say, we start with what we have and not aspire to create things we don't even have an ability to. And as you very importantly said, the difference is just having goodwill doesn't actually can't be the anchor of a strategic plan for development. Can I just ask you for a 30-second response to Professor Ubi's remark about, how can we have the pens made in Nigeria rather than, a Chinese pen made in Nigeria? You see what I think, the commonly made criticism of some of the Chinese companies going on offshoring. I know it's a complex issue, but if you could give us a quick response to that, 30 seconds or so, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I think Nigeria is a populous country, and its comparative advantage clearly consists. It lies in rather cheap labor. So there are millions of choices for labor-intensive industries. So what is important is really for Nigeria to find out what is consistent with your comparative advantage. So it could be pens, it could be apparels, it could be some other things. So I think what is crucial is that really, even in Nigeria is a big country, even different region in Nigeria. So you have different endowment structure, factor endowment structure different, natural endowment structure different, institutional endowment structure different. So your comparative advantage could be different. So I think what is really important is, look at the local kind of conditions, and then, and for China is now losing the comparative advantage in many labor-intensive industries. Mm-hmm. So there's a big room for the industry takeover by African countries, including Nigeria. So I think there's a big room.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor, can I ask you, if you don't mind, that is hopefully have helped to you as well. Some of the things you said about your ideas about the what we have as a focal point for development, and also the jobs, etc. If you have a book that essentially outlines this, please share it in the chat, even the name, etc. I for one would love to read it, and I'm sure there are many others. So please do share something that you think could be recommended, even if it's in Chinese. Don't worry, we'll all find a way to read it. So thank you. Now let me move back to Mr. Syed. Mr. Syed, you gave us a lot of good information about Pakistan, but you've heard the input from Professor Ubi. You've heard the response from Professor Wang as well. So how do you relate that? And maybe to be a bit more specific, can I ask you, you painted a positive picture, which is great. I think all of us would like to see Pakistan move up the trajectory in a big way. It's a complex nation. So with all of these investments, and you said BRI is one of the key things that's triggering reform and change, where do you see Pakistan in 30 years with this sort of, you said it was the first time that this kind of money came in, etc. So, two questions in there. Please share your thoughts with us, please.
I think that I just shared with you what I witnessed in Pakistan. So the picture that I've painted is an eyewitness account,
Yes.
I would say. And second, I see Pakistan in a great position in 30 years. We have a youth bulge, demographic dividend. We are globally relevant economically and politically. There's investment happening in Pakistan, and we have a blossoming middle class. We have over 65 million internet users, with smartphone users, and our economy has stabilized. Um, but I have heard our friend from Nigeria. It's a very important country, and there's a lot happening in Africa. There's one article that I would recommend, which was in the Washington Post a few years ago, by a group of John Hopkins researchers about BRI in Africa. It's called "The U.S. Policymakers Get China in Africa All Wrong." And it's a fantastic analysis of BRI. It's slightly dated, but I think it still holds. And I also heard a professor from the Peking University, which is also my alma mater, by the way. I spent almost a year in 2019 in Peking University. But I think I want to add one point, which I think would render this conversation incomplete if we do not discuss it. And
Please.
that is the communication strategy of the BRI.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we've talked about the advantages to Africa and Pakistan, what China's outline is, the professor has said, and what, how, industrialization for Global South. But we are having this event right now, and your think tank, GIFT, is, I think, done a remarkable job. And you had a communication strategy, right? You partnered with Pakistan-China Institute for Communication, for marketing of this and others. But China decided to undertake a huge mammoth initiative, which would obviously, create waves, both positive, and some would look at that skeptically. It would ruffle some feathers. But we saw that there was no sophisticated, nuanced communication strategy that comes with such a large project. And this is I would say, the single most largest foreign policy initiative of China since the opening up and reform of Deng Xiaoping. And we see that the lack of the communication strategy, I saw the communication strategy to be learning on the job. But there was not a well thought out, crafted communication strategy where the SOEs, the publicity department of Chinese government, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs was present, a coordinated, coherent, intertwined strategy for the countries this was happening in, and also for the Western audience. So we saw a very defensive approach to the BRI. We saw an onslaught from the West, like our friend from Nigeria mentioned, and then we saw defensive, reactive mechanism of responding to those criticisms rather than a preemptive, initiative-based, innovative approach that we see coming from the West, which is more honed, more sophisticated. So I think that has a lack of communication strategy, I think, has adversely impacted the Belt and Road's image in not only in the Western hemisphere, but I would say that also in a lot of the Global South countries. So it's very important that as the second decade of the Belt and Road has started in 2023, that is honed, that is troubleshooted, and that is improved. Because the topic of this dialogue that you are hosting is taking stock. So I think this is very important to take stock, because if there is so much investment, but that investment should, for any major power or major player, should wield soft power. So we see that more could have been done in that regard. Just wanted to add that.
I think that's such an astute observation. I think, as you rightly said, this conversation would be wholly incomplete if we didn't discuss this. And I want to thank you for being so observant and making this remark. I can tell you that our efforts together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs through the Commissioner's Office in Hong Kong is actually part of a more oblique communication channel. And I think my Chinese friends will also agree with me that we all think, friends of China, that they should improve their comms and PR. And that's why we're all here, not as PR agents, but as people who want to communicate from the ground in Nigeria, from the ground in Pakistan, and in the series we've done from the ground in Europe, in Australia, and elsewhere. So such an important point. I could not, say anything more. That you've added something so important to this. We've got about 10 minutes left. Professor Ubi, you've heard the response from Professor Wang on this issue of start with what we have, and just not just focusing on Nigeria, but the African experience as well. And as someone who lived in Africa for a while, I couldn't agree more with Professor Wang's statement, and also from Asia, that quite a lot of the development aid is, here's what you need to do to be like us. And I don't want to make it a sort of divisive argument, but where's the policy making? Coming back to your point about we need to be able to negotiate what we want and get good advice. And to the point that Professor Wang made as well about the BRI is also about ideas. So where the idea is coming from in Africa that helps shape this thing and then targets it to what we have and therefore what we need. And we need to do ourselves. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you once again for the opportunity. I listened to my distinguished colleagues of Professor Said and Professor Wang, and there's a question of a focus of Professor Wang where he talked about what industries we have in Africa. I wouldn't accept the fact that we should look at comparative advantage, because when you talk about comparative advantage, what we can produce, what we can do, you found that the International Division of Labor has already placed Africa in a particular dimension, and the dimension is that Africa produces the raw material. Why we don't want to be producing raw materials? We want to also add values to that raw material. So when you say comparative advantage, start from what you have, then you're still telling me to go back to plantations, excavating minerals, from our exploration of minerals and all that, and the drilling of oil and keep selling. So that is beyond that. What I mean by outsourcing is, if we are producing crude oil, why don't you come set up a refinery here? If it's your company. Like you rightly noted, Nigeria is 1/4 of Africa's market. Nigeria is 3/4 of ECOWAS market. So if you have the Nigerian market, it's as good as having a larger chunk of African market. That is just the beginning, So I think that the industries, the outsourcing, offshoring of some aspect of the industry should be one of the key considerations in our relationship with China. Now, I really liked what Professor Said said. He talked about communication. I think I need to address that too, in my own little way. You see, when I speak with the Chinese audience, I tell them, just leave propaganda to the West. They are so good at propaganda. Now, the Chinese is actually not good with propaganda. And I don't know whether it's a policy that they don't want to get in propaganda, or they don't want to let out, a lot of information. But I think it is high time, because it is based on this lack of information, like I said, and misinformation, that is creating the disinformation about China, about the Belt and Road Initiative. I think the Chinese should begin to change that aspect of their foreign policy. Yeah, propaganda. In fact, you study it as a course in the university, under international relations or political science. And so the Chinese need to begin to, know how to come about information and use information. I don't want to call it propaganda, but however they have to do it, but just to portray to the world that they are not what the world think they are. You know, before I conclude, I would like to address the issue of the Belt and Road Initiative. You know, like I said, it's a myth. It's a myth, and this is what my minister of our Nigerian minister of information said, that the debt trap narrative claiming that China is using BRI to influence African countries is an insult to African countries. And I've said this while he has seen it from that perspective, I have discussed with a lot of fellow colleagues. You see, when they discuss on rivalry in Africa, you know, US-China rivalry in Africa, US emerging economies rivalry, you trivialize Africa. You make Africa look like a cake that can be shared among people. You know, you take us back to 1884, 1885, where Africa map was kept on the table and dissected amongst the superpowers. I think the 21st century, we should move beyond that. We shouldn't be talking about rivalry. Why do we talk about rivalry? Why can't we talk about cooperation for Africa's development, cooperation for the global South development? These are the things that we need to do. And if you come to Africa, the data shows that we are not, no country is in a debt trap. For instance, out of about 20 something billion dollars that we owe to the multilateral, I'm in terms of our bilateral debt, it's 20 something billion dollars. We are owing China only 4 billion. So where is the debt trap discourse? Where's the debt trap in all this? Now, let me take you back to the 1980s and 1990s, where there was also the debt trap discourse. As at that time, China was still not really open. China was still closed. So who was Africa owing at that time? So you see, this is all part of the propaganda. Now, the whole history of that, the debt trap in the 80s or in the 70s, 80s, 90s is all lost. Now we're talking about a new debt trap. When many countries in Africa are owing maybe just 3%, 4%. You know, so these are the things that China needs to take into consideration and be able to reel out information, you know, such that the populace will have access to this information and be able to analyze, you know, intuitively whether China is supporting rogue state, whether China is coming back to recolonize Africa, or whether China is going to take Africa's sovereignty.
Thank you, Professor. I got 2 minutes left. I'm sure the audience will allow me to go on a bit by extra minute. So I'm going to give you all the last word on this. So, Professor, I'm going to, since you spoke last, Professor Ubi, in 30 seconds or a bit more, but not more than a minute at the most, where do you see the BRI going over the next, because, you know, here we are taking stock. Where do you see the BRI going in the next 10 years in Africa? I've only got the luxury of giving you a minute. And what must China do? 1 minute, please. Next 10 years.
Just 1 minute, yes. I will stick to my 1 minute and maybe less than a minute. I see the next 10 years as a prospect for our relationship so for countries in Africa and China. With regards to the BRI, I think more effort should be put into the initiative, you know, to be able to maximize its benefit. Now, I will conclude by saying that, you see, it is one thing to promise and another thing to fulfill. Whether it is under the platform of FOCAC or under the platform of the Belt and Road Initiative, or even the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, these are all initiatives of the Chinese government. And at the last FOCAC promises of President Xi Jinping, I think all this should come to fruition. It shouldn't just be another paper discussion. Will let us begin to see the infrastructures on the ground, and we'll begin to see a new development model. And I'll conclude by saying that it is high time Africans understand that development is a deliberate process. Now, we can also learn lessons of development from China. We can adopt and adapt what fits into our social structural dynamics and not just copy development model and not just wait for prescription from whether the Chinese or from the West. I think that Africa needs to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Obi. Really good. The ability to cooperate rather than divide. and also that China's Africa should lead that process rather than be dependent. And that process, hopefully, the BRI is initiated. Mr. Saeed, your 1 minute to conclude on where do you see all of this leading in the next 10 years in Pakistan, and what one piece of advice would you give apart from better comms in terms of the relationship between Pakistan and China?
Yes, I think that Pakistan has already shown success for the larger BRI for Chinese companies. I think that better assimilation with local community, better understanding of the stakeholders apart from the central government in global south countries where Chinese companies operate, like media, civil society, think tanks, local communities where the project is, and better CSR would, I think, yield more success for BRI and future investments. And I see a positive trajectory of Pakistan in the overall BRI index.
Very good. And, I think your point about the long-term benefits to Pakistan with the specifics you gave resonates with many. It certainly resonated with me. I want to go and research some of this because a lot of us don't know anything about this. So maybe your institution also could do some publicity and tell the world about the great things you're doing, what's being achieved. Finally, Professor Wang, you've heard I'm assuming the Chinese government listens to you. What advice would you give the Chinese government based on what you heard? So much positive stuff, but as we all know, and I think this ingrained in the Chinese thinking, there's always room for improvement. So in 1 minute, what do you think the next 10 years should be, and what advice would you give the Chinese government?
Okay, first of all, I think I'm very confident about the future of the Belt and Road Initiative. Because I think it is a kind of joint effort of all developing countries who seek for economic prosperity and development. So today's world is very complicated. Many geopolitical forces are there. But I think all developing countries, especially Belt and Road countries, want to have peaceful economic prosperity. And this is and the BNI initiative is mutually beneficial. I think it's really what I see is a really great effort for the global South to work together to add more stability of the world economy. Now, China contributes to 30% of world economic growth in the past 10 years. But I think that when BNI initiative are more successful, that would imply that the global welfare will be greatly enhanced. So I think my only advice or suggestion to China's government is that, okay, listen to all the partners of BNI countries and find the obstacles, find the challenges, and find the solutions together. I'm saying this is a noble thing to do. This is not only good for other countries, but also good for China as well. So let's do it more effectively.
Professor Wang, thank you so much. And this question about listening, I think there's a lot of room for even creating some kind of BRI dialogue forum that is separate from just the usual formats. And I think we're hearing that very clearly from this, and that could possibly be an outcome. So I'm hugely frustrated that we have run out of time. I find this so intellectually engaging that I could sit with you all, gentlemen, for another hour, and I'm sure the audience will all hang with this. But, we don't have limitless time. So can I just say, thanks a million for joining us, sharing us with your insights. I can guarantee you that this will be listened to and viewed by thousands over the next few weeks because there's an online audience, but it will be put on YouTube and through all our channels. And I, for one, we, our institute, would love to stay in touch. And please keep up your good work. And I'll try my best to have you back, some form or shape, to come and share your great insights. It's been intellectually extremely stimulating. Lots of questions. I couldn't go through all of them. So on behalf of everyone, the organizers, etc., thank you so much. And now I'll hand over to our MC, who will start the next session. I hope all of you, the audience, and also the panel members, if you have the luxury of time, please hang on. We have a very great panel, and we have a keynote speaker coming up as well, who I think you'll enjoy. Over to you, Liana.
Thank you, Chandran. Thank you, Professor Wang, Mr. Syed, and Professor Ubi for your on-the-ground insights on the current positive impacts and challenges of the BRI. It was particularly interesting that there is a very big gap in what the media portrays versus what is really happening in country. The challenge is in the need for more information to inform the public on the BRI. I hope everyone agrees that these are certainly very insightful perspectives from the partner countries, and we have a better understanding of how China's views on cooperation and development vary from the West. We're now going to begin discussing panel 2, Charting the Future Path, What's Next for the BRI. This panel will be focusing on envisioning the future of the BRI in light of the various challenges and factors that shape the new global order. What mechanisms may China utilize in preparing for potential risk or opportunities for cooperation? How can BRI help rethink the approach to sustainable infrastructure and green technologies in our interconnected world? To discuss these issues, we have an exciting lineup of panelists. Mr. Mukhtar Malik Hussain, who is on the Board of Governors of the Asia School of Business and former HSBC Group General Manager and Regional Head of BRI for HSBC Asia Pacific. Mr. Hussein Asghari, Founding Board Member and Vice President of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, and Dr. Ziying Wu, Research Assistant Professor at Ningnan University, Hong Kong. They will bring their international perspectives to explore the answers to these questions and more. If you have any questions for our moderators and panelists, please enter them in the Q&A box below. For our moderator, we are delighted to have Mr. Ali Borani, Managing Director of 360 Strategic Advisors. He's also co-founder and co-host of the BRI Dialogues podcast with Durham University's Al Sabah program. Last year, Ali co-authored a deep dive report on the rise of Chinese multinationals, interviewing over 30 senior leaders in Western firms. His Future Early blog offers sharp insights at the intersection of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and shifting global power. The link is in the chat below. Ali joins us today from London. Over to you, Ali.
Liana, thank you so much and for that kind and generous introduction. Hello to everyone from Hong Kong to Houston, from Dubai to Dar es Salaam. I've had the privilege of being on many panels in my life as a participant and moderated many, but I have to tell you today I'm very excited. And excited for the reason that we're coming together when the tectonic plates are shifting globally, when international rules-based order is looking more like international rules bias disorder, where the old legacy order is facing what I call the fiscal osteoporosis of bulging deficit and debt, and when the Washington consensus finds itself backpedaling from almost all of the sustainability goals, all of the ambitions, the virtues lectured, and all the international norms are being even challenged, whether it's in punitive arbitrary tariffs, sanctions, or preemptive strikes of late. I recently wrote a piece in which I said the United States is facing a crisis of 4C. In diamonds, it's carat, color, clarity, and but in case of United States, it's credibility, crisis of currency, commerce, character, and credibility among friends and foes, allies and adversaries. So with this background, and 12 years later of the initiation of BRI as a initiative and the largest alternative undertaking to the status quo, I'm joined by an outstanding panel today. And the reason I say that is that they are so diverse in their backgrounds. A former banker who's been through the thick and thin of BRI. If somebody knows what's happening in the world of finance, we have Mukhtar with us. A Chinese scholar at the heart of sustainability who understands where the world is going in that context. And a geopolitical strategist and a co-founder from the heart of Europe, as Hussain. So consider today as an MRI of BRI. So we're going to conduct an MRI on BRI. Some housekeeping notes. I'm going to shortly invite my panel to kindly introduce themselves, their areas of expertise. Share your questions in the Q&A box. We try to address as many of them as we can. And despite the fact that we're going into a changing world order, certain things don't change. So ladies first. Zain, why don't you kick off by introducing yourself, followed by Hussain and Mukhtar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. And yeah, thank you, everyone. And thanks for the great opportunity for me to be part of the dialogue on very timely issues. I'm Zain Wu, and now actually working at Lingnan University in Hong Kong as a research assistant professor. I received my PhD, back at Boston University in the US, and I have been working with Professor Ye Ming from the Party Schools of BU on the latest developments of BRI. So my sharing today actually is based on my joint research with her on particularly about the Green Road Initiative. So I look forward to actually exchanging views with the panelists and Ali, and I also look forward to hearing from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Zain. Hussain?
Thank you, Ali. I'm honored to be within this special event, the Global Institute for Tomorrow. What a wonderful description of such a great think tank and research center. So my name is Hussain Askari. I'm born and raised in Iraq. I was born in Baghdad, and until I finished my education as a translator and interpreter. I survived the civil war in the 70s in Iraq. I survived 8 years of the Iran-Iraq war, and I survived the first Gulf War, which is called the Kuwait Liberation War. But when I went to Europe in '92, and joining and learning from the International Schiller Institute, I realized that besides justice, economic development is the key to security and peace. And in that sense, I started to study economic and strategic matters independently. In 1996, I joined a team of, maybe you don't see this, to publish the first ever I wrote a chapter on this special report. It's a study of the Eurasian land bridge, the new Silk Road locomotive for worldwide economic development. It was published in January 1997, and it has all the maps and how to connect Eurasia and also Africa with infrastructure. The irony was that we wanted France and Germany to take the initiative at the time, but they were busy with other things. When the Belt and Road Initiative was announced in 2013, we were celebrating, and we published another report. It's called The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, which is 400 pages. It covers the whole planet, including the Americas, how to connect all the nations of the world with infrastructure specifically. But in 2018, we started here. We realized that there is an enormous lack of information about the Belt and Road Initiative, but also there's a lot of disinformation. So we started the Belt and Road Institute to give people objective information, but also to debunk some of the mythology around the Belt and Road, like the debt trap. In that process, I became an expert on debunking the debt trap. I developed a method to do that in 3 steps, which I can share with you. So this has been my area.
Well, Hussain, having survived all of those 3, may you teach us about survival skills at some point as well. God bless you. Thank you for being with us. Mukhtar, to you now.
Thank you very much, Ali, and allow me to kick off by thanking Chandran and his team for the invitation to join you today. My background is really one largely in finance. I've spent 40 years being a banker. I had the great privilege of working for HSBC throughout my career. And the world's a very interesting place where you sit on the shoulders of giants that have been operating in many of these markets over many years, and you see both the macro picture and the micro picture. I had the great privilege of working with many distinguished colleagues, and I suppose my exposure across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and latterly in Asia, was particularly important because we saw BRI both launched, and we saw the early challenges that it faced as a financial institution. And of course, as a global financial institution, it was very important that we took a responsible approach towards how we would tackle the opportunity and indeed the risk that BRI represented. And Ali, I look forward to sharing some of those experiences with you during the course of this dialogue.
Thank you very much. I'm excited. I thank you all for short introductions, but ever for meaningful. Let's continue with you, Mukhtar. There's this old saying as it goes like, cui bono, follow the money, who's benefiting? Can you shed some light in 5 minutes for us on the background of the tectonic shifts in and around the world of finance, the ramifications, implications between the past 12 years and now, with the arrival of BRI, and in context of all of the sanctions, asset seizures, and how you see this web in the world of fractured finance and a fractured world? Can you elaborate on that and set the stage for us?
Well, perhaps, Ali, the place to start might be just to provide some historical context around, the generic thematic of infrastructure finance. And if you just look at the data points, whether they're from 10 years ago or whether they're from now, there's a consistency in what they point out repeatedly, which is that the demand for infrastructure finance, particularly in the global south, is completely submerged in terms of size by the available lack of capital. And that lack of capital, whether it comes from the financial markets, from the DFIs, or from governments, simply can't meet that demand. And that was the case, by the way, before 2013. If you look at it now, in reality, around $3 to $4 trillion of capital is required to meet the existing requirements for infrastructure. The BRI probably has provided about $1 trillion $3 against that figure of 4. And other initiatives from Europe and the US have contributed more moderately in terms of size, about 300 billion, but they've contributed a lot in terms of rhetoric and in terms of pushback against this initiative. So I think just painting the picture, infrastructure is going to be a consistent requirement of the world, irrespective of the geopolitics. Finding that capital and mobilizing that capital remains one of the key challenges we have. And I think the BRI has served a very significant purpose in terms of mobilizing more capital in a shorter period of time for countries which are particularly needy in the global south.
Thank you for that. That sets the stage. Last year, I was speaking in Montreal, and my fellow panelists said, oh, America still leads by the culture, and we bring the cultural dominance. I said, you can bring Britney Spears, I don't know, Taylor Swift, but Chinese will bring the stadium because people still have to gather and watch the concert. On that note, can you elaborate a bit on this 53% reported by FT of late? That China's own cross-border transactions, including trade, financial flows, and internal transactions, are all in renminbi. That's a massive uptick. It's up from 40% in 2021. And in that context, given everything that is happening, are we moving from TINA, there is no alternative, to a TIA, which is there is an alternative, and how quickly that alternative may manifest itself?
Well, I think, Ali, look, I think firstly, the growth of the RMB has been ongoing for decades now. It's been a very measured process. It's very closely tied to obviously the trade figures, and as China has globalized its footprint, then the ability to use its own currency both domestically and cross-border has increased. So I'm not surprised at the 53%, and one can firmly expect that to increase. I think the more interesting question is, can the RMB be used for important global commodities such as oil? Is that a future trend that we are probably going to see? And I believe that that will be the case. But I think this is a slow, steady progress. It's not, a revolution overnight. But it's certainly very encouraging for China domestically that that the use of the RMB is now more prominent. And I think that also is important for the domestic Chinese market, particularly in terms of managing savings, and how that RMB is deployed once it's generated.
Now, when you look at BRI, Mukhtar, in many cases, China acts as a boot operator, build, operate, own, and transfer, and an off-taker. But the plumbings of the financial world. Can China benefit from bringing some of these projects into a refinancing model, whether it's private capital, regional funds beyond, the multilateral financial large institutions like NDB or AIIB? And for that, what has to happen? And if that happens, how will that accelerate or affect BRI's development?
Look, I think it's essential for China to demonstrate as frequently as it can that BRI is an open, inclusive project, that one can participate in financial institutions if they're satisfied with the risk-reward structures, that they have every opportunity to participate in BRI financing. But I think people often come to a shuddering end with the word financing. Let me remind everybody that financing is the beginning of the process, not the end of it. So, once you get the financing in place, then some consideration needs to be given to refinancing. Some consideration needs to be given to crowding in more diverse financial structures. It's not just debt. Equity is important. Funds are important. The ability to mobilize capital ensures that you get a much bigger bang for your buck, rather than everything in effect being either equity financed by governments or debt finance, in which case, you run the specter of the kind of debt trap diplomacy debate that we were having earlier on. So I think that, my belief is that over time, BRI will attract more sources of capital. And Ali, I would leave you with the thought that, there are probably around 2,500-3,000 BRI projects that have been started since 2013. I would suggest that at least 20 to 30% of them have been completed. They have cash flows, they have operators, and that provides normally an opportunity for financial institutions to think about what can they do to support that growth, because a lot of the risk of completion is out of the way, and it's the risk of operation that they're financing, and those two risk profiles are very different. So I do think there is an inventory of BRI projects which are now in the completion stage that lend themselves to crowding in new sources of finance.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your input. We will definitely come back and revisit the elements of finance. As you rightly said, I always think as finance as the oxygen. It has to go into the lungs, and then you can decide how to gonna exhale and bring the rest of it. But talking about oxygen, we also have to talk about environment and about the climate. And I would like to bring Zhang into the conversation to elaborate a little bit around this green BRI, because we've been into virtue signaling in the West. There's a lot of talk, but we see backpedaling with the arrival of President Trump in the office from a lot of initiatives. In 2022, 2023 alone, China spent $890 billion on green initiatives. So when you look at it, Zhang, and you look at the footprint of BRI, how significant, how important, and how central the green BRI has been? And is this part of the fabric of BRI as this initiative expands into the global South? And if that is the case, how will that make BRI a different initiative comparing to Global Gateway or Build Back a Better World and the rest of it?
Yep, thank you, Ali. That was a good lead-in. So the Green BRI didn't start, from the very beginning, with BRI. So the latest developments of BRI is much about green development. But, the BRI is great. We have fantastic infrastructures, great financing, and really helping, a lot of developing countries, thriving. But there is one downside of, the early stage of BRI, which is about actually its environmental deficiency. So there was a lot of international criticisms about the early kind of BRI projects that actually brings a lot of environmental issues in host countries. And to address this question and problems, the Beijing launched green development under BRI in 2017. And things didn't go actually fantastic all of a sudden or actually immediately. It's actually started with little implementation in its early stage, mainly because of three reasons. One, at the very beginning, there was lack of the participation of private green industries from China because the green companies were attracted to the advanced countries. There you have more luxurious market. So profit-driven private company went to Europe or actually North America. And so the Green BRI was actually mostly kind of involving the local governments and state-owned enterprises. And local governments, some of them, particularly those bordering BRI countries, they actually may not have share exactly the same, political objective or actually economic priorities with Beijing. So the actual implementation of the Green BRI has limited output. But things got changed, surprisingly, during COVID and actually after COVID. And we witnessed actually sudden growth of green exports and green investments from China to BRI countries during COVID and post-COVID, and it is still ongoing. And this shift actually occurred for two factors. One, the global trade interruptions caused by COVID. And second was the US impositions of tariffs, significantly increased tariffs on China's green products. So these two interruptions actually brought private companies, Chinese private green companies, to realign their commercial interests with Beijing and to promote green development under the BRI. Therefore, actually leads to the substantial growth of the GBRI. And this growth, hopefully would lead to more substantial implementation and more substantial outputs on green protections and green development in the host country. So this actually was, our research.
Carry on. Mm-hmm. Carry on, Zane.
Yeah, and this was our research finding. Overall, our research finding point to the fact that the developments of BRI and currently the Green BRI is contingent upon the dynamic between the state and private sector against the backdrops of geopolitics around the world. So it's not, just simplistic pictures or state-centric projects, private sector, civil society, all actors in the host countries count towards the effects of the BRI. So later on, perhaps, we have more elaborations on this, but I will stop here as a brief introduction.
Thank you. No, I'm happy that Mukhtar is here as well. A great deal of discussion these days is about the future of finance, the central bank digital currencies, the role of AI. So I have a question for both of you. And, this shift, technological, financial, and geopolitical, will have ramifications on the pillars of architecture of money where I would like Mukhtar to say a few words about where are we going with CBDCs and the future of decentralized finance in context of BRI, and as well from an energy point of view, saying if you could talk about that, given the sheer scale that China has invested in the value chain, in the entire value chain from upstream to downstream, does that create, I would say, a BRI advantage for China to take these countries as much as, for instance, in Kenya, the legacy telephone systems didn't exist, and then, M-Pesa, and then they came and they jumped immediately to mobile. Are we going to witness the same jump on green initiatives because of China's role tied to the world of finance? Mukhtar, why don't you kick off on CBDCs and the future of digital currencies, and then we bring in Zain.
I think, Ali, digitalization has been underway obviously for some time. It's now reached a level of maturity where some of the legislative rails are now in place for people to feel more comfortable in the use of that currency. The involvement of central banks gives a level of authenticity and rigor to the introduction of digitalized currencies as part of the payments framework. I think I would probably only hesitate to suggest that digitalized currencies are going to suddenly form the backbone of BRI, because they're not. I think what they form is an option where that option probably at the early stages is more relevant to the retail market than it is to the wholesale market. So people can pay electricity bills, they can use it as a mode of settlement. As opposed to raising large sums of money through the digitalized market, which at this point of time doesn't really have the scale and it doesn't have enough operational expertise to perhaps support some of the bigger BRI transactions that we alluded to earlier on. So I think it's very much work in progress. I do think it'll become stronger and more stable over time, but I think we have to manage our expectations about how quickly it will reach that stage of maturity.
Okay. And Zain?
Thank you. So I think money is important, but money is not everything. Particularly, money doesn't always lead to good results. So I guess the answers from my side is very much depending on, despite the increase of, financing in the green development from the Chinese side, I think it depends on how the money is used and how the money is received in the host country. So there has been improvements on how Chinese actors use money in promoting green development in BRI countries. So there has been guidelines issued to regulate those very specific practices and investments, make sure that there is no greenwashing, there is strict following the international standards and local standards to protect the local environment. So I think the Chinese has been trying to better use the money, but there is still problems in materializing the expected output. There is still a lot of challenges in the host country. Our research actually found that there is still relatively weak local governance on environmental protection. There are still limited regulations on this, right? And there is also limited involvement with the civil society, the local people in the decision-making process. But they actually receive the direct effects or side effects from bad practices. So I think all this actually require better coordinations between among the Chinese actors and host actors. Also need perhaps in the future China need to provide trainings for local governments or actually local actors to have better practice in green development and green governance. governance actually is one new area I think China hasn't been focused on, particularly the BRI project has not been particularly, talking about or practices, although there has been a lot of training workshops for officials from developing countries. But I think this can be, further improved in the future, and the Chinese government and the whole local governments in the host countries can better collaborate on this as well to improve their governance capacity.
Thank you for that. I'm sure we will revisit the dialogue of environment and finance in a few minutes, but I'd like to thank Hussain for his patience, and I'd like to bring him in because I think all of these things are happening at the time that geopolitics is the foundation of many of these developments. We live at the time, Hussain, that I think despite the packaging of worries about non-proliferation, the West's concern is proliferation of trade, new trade routes, the new trade corridors. And in that light, West Asia, also known as Middle East, has been at the center of it, not only because you're an Iraqi national, but European global citizen. Can you take a few minutes in highlighting this complex web of I2U2, India, Israel, United States, and United Arab Emirates, the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, and how these things dance in this dance of cloak and daggers and seven veils with BRI, and how will that affect the ambitions of BRI for connecting the heartland all together?
Yeah, well, I will put it in the context of the larger question, which the whole purpose of this webinar is that we're in the future of the Belt and Road Initiative. By the way, I'm writing the second volume of my co-authored book, Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, and it's being simultaneously translated to Chinese, so it will be released in November in both English and as you said, West Asia, the so-called Middle East, have become a central part of this. But let me just say, I use this saying a lot because the question is, what is the future of the BRI? And I think the best way, the saying goes the best way to predict the future is by building it yourself. And I think this illustrates China's economic development philosophy, this long-term plan where China wants to be in 2049, and building it itself. And the Belt and Road Initiative, in the same way, will be determined by this symbiosis between what China wants to be in the future and what China's partners also want to be in the future. But unless we have a cataclysmic event on the planet, like if we have a third world war fought with thermonuclear weapons, or we get hit by an asteroid, a massive asteroid, which will wipe out life on Earth. If these two things don't happen, the Belt and Road Initiative will become bigger, more dynamic, and more colorful. It will become bigger because more nations will join it, and it will also incorporate other dynamics like the BRICS, where China have a leading role, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other structures. We just recently saw the China-ASEAN GCC Summit, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the China-Africa Cooperation. All these things will make the Belt and Road more much larger. The dynamic is, as I said, China's own growth. I was in the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative in Beijing, where President Xi Jinping spoke, and he said, China will only do well when the world is doing well. And when China does well, the world will do even better. So we have a dynamic now where China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, is contributing to creating new Chinas in all Asia and Africa, but smaller Chinas, where industrialization and modernization is the goal. It's not simply survival, but industrializing these nations. I can give many examples. So, if the time allows, like from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, Ethiopia. We had our friend from Nigeria discussing these. But things are happening already now where the Arab countries, African countries, and Asian countries are becoming more valuable for China than the United States and the EU. So that's the dynamic. And it will become more colorful because other contributors will come in. And it's the question of financing is very key, where we see that the BRICS new development bank, and also now we have the sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf Cooperation Council and other nations are now contributing to building infrastructure, industry, agriculture, and bringing their resources to the table. And that's why it will become more colorful. Now, as you mentioned in your question, of course, the geopolitics is the most destructive part. We saw what happened in Iran. And I mean, if you look at Iran, you can take two scenarios where Iran is a massive country. It's very central geographically. It has enormous resources, including human resources, something which people don't really know. Iran is one of the most advanced in terms of education, especially in the STEM area, science, technology, and engineering. Iran, despite all the sanctions imposed on it in 40 years, has one of the best infrastructures. I traveled in Iran. I was in Iran in May or, before this, and I saw the infrastructure. It's much better than Iraq, for example, which has been under American, British control the last 20 years. The healthcare, the education, the scientific ambitions of Iran. Now, imagine if there are no sanctions. Imagine if there's cooperation with Iran, where Iran can both export but also import technology. Iran will explode in terms of economic growth, and it will contribute to the whole region. So you have this geopolitics now. There are these ideas that are floated by the Western players that geopolitics is some sort of a disease because it's based on zero-sum game, which is not real. It's not scientific. This idea that if somebody becomes powerful, you will automatically become weak, or somebody becomes rich, you will become poor. This is in the world of limited resources, which does not belong to human society. Human society's most important resource is the mind and scientific and technological progress. This is the most important source. Geopoliticians, they believe in physical assets, oil, gas, coal, geographical location, and they think that's the most important. And therefore, all these ideas about the build back better world, the EU's global gateway, and the India, Middle East, Israel, EU corridor, which we have seen has become a major disaster. It was buried under the rubble in Gaza right now, and it does not work because the premise it's based on is geopolitics and zero-sum game to undermine China. China is already involved in all the projects the India, Middle East, EU corridor is talking about. The railways, the ports, the industrial zones, and all these things. China is already there. So why not work with China instead of, trying to undermine China?
Well, I like to bring Mukhtar in again with both of you, because I think I wrote a piece a few weeks ago. I said in this Belt and Road Initiative, I know it's a sea belt and the road, but I said Iran is very much the buckle of the belt, So, and if Iran and Iraq and that patch of land of Mesopotamia is undone, perhaps this belt is not going to hold that tight. The key question I have for both of you from a world of finance and from a world of geopolitics is there is very little agency, at least on surface at the moment, among the GCC that if they have to take a side, they will, let go of Huawei and go with Microsoft or other AI decision makings. When the push comes to shove, Mukhtar, and there is the world and talk of sanctions, President Trump is very mercurial at the moment, talking about taking Greenland, Canada. How do you see the threat of sanctions, asset seizures of the GCC at large, if they don't play ball, in the context of BRI, and the geopolitics of it, Hussain? How pragmatically do you think China is going about it? And what are the options? You're either with us or against us in this competition for the heartland.
Perhaps I can kick off. I mean, I think to your question around the imposition of sanctions in the GCC for trade or other activities with Iran and other countries. I think that's a reality actually most countries have been with and navigate that fairly carefully. Do I think that, we're going to find my perspective? I think that they want to try and maintain, however best as they can, an equality between their relationship in the East and their historic relationships in the West. And we must never forget that actually the future markets, particularly for hydrocarbons, are predominantly in the East. And so to that extent, they've got to find a way of navigating that path. But at the same time, they've got to find a way of also making sure that they don't trickle over the edge, as they say, into finding themselves, at the displeasure of global bodies. But I do think one of the challenges that the financial system faces, and it's a broader challenge, Ali, is when you weaponize currency, when you weaponize sanctions, right? That's going to create, an imbalance in how people look at things. I think in a world which was quote unquote less weaponized or not weaponized, free choice would dictate that they dealt with both sides, which is we've got to try and find a way of finding a peaceful equilibrium at a time of very extraordinary tensions both sides.
Thank you, Hussain. And you, from a lens of geopolitics?
Well, I think I would like to focus more on economics here, but the Gulf Cooperation Council, they have been trying to balance their relationship, but there is a reality, something which people forget about. If you look at trade between Saudi Arabia and China in the last 20 years, it went from $3 billion per year to $160 billion per year, at like more than 30-time increase, while with the United States, it has stayed at the same area. But it's not simply trade. The Gulf Cooperation Council, like many raw material exporting countries, have been shocked many times when the oil price dips below $30. They go almost bankrupt. And they want to diversify. They don't want to live in that reality. And therefore, they have embarked on an industrialization process, but also investment process where they use their sovereign wealth funds, which in the Gulf Cooperation Council is about $5 trillion. This is enormous wealth. It was traditionally invested in British, American, and European banking sector, real estate, but now they're diverting part of that wealth to physical economic projects at home. No, people don't know that Saudi Arabia is becoming an industrial powerhouse. I will give you just one example. Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund financed a project with the Chinese computer producer Lenovo to build a laptop production plant in Saudi Arabia for $2 billion. So this is where the money is being used. Saudi Arabia is working with China to build massive petrochemical industries. So the value of a barrel of oil is not $80, but it becomes $800 or $8,000 instead by transforming it into other products. This is the reality. And also many nations in Africa, they say, like Zimbabwe, say, we are no longer interested in exporting lithium. We want to build battery factories here. And who responded? China said, well, we can build the battery plant in Zimbabwe. So this is the dynamic of reality. And they try to pretend that the American threats don't exist. And they are working slowly with China to intensify that cooperation, parallel with keeping their relation with the US open.
That's very interesting. I'm still of the opinion that what Mukhtar said has sent shivers and down the spine of countries. When you seize the assets of Russia, 300 billion, and you start becoming, very arbitrary in your treatment of global capital as a custodian, that can change the things. But talking about cobalt and talking about lithium, Zhang, China is at the heart of processing rare earth minerals. And a lot of countries that it's involved in would be, overlooked, ignored. At the time that Theresa May was in office, she went to Kenya after about 3.5 decades as the first prime minister, not having visited Kenya, which is part of the Commonwealth. You think about it. So a great deal of this regret that why China is here, why China is there, is when you don't show up, other people will show up. Is China in a position to not only help the upstream, not only to bring the industries, but to hold the hand of these nations in developing their sovereign wealth funds from the minerals that they have? Is that something, I know it's a twisted question for you because you're coming from the pure environment of it, and maybe Mukhtar or Hussain would like to weave in as well, but can China lead in a different, even more holistic way of saying, hey, I am investing, I am taking your lithium, I am processing it back in my country, but let's look at your long-term sustainability and well-being, and hold the hand of Canada Teachers Pension Fund, hold the hand of Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and help you to develop that holistic financial, I would say, core muscles as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is a great question. Perhaps, well, beyond my knowledge. So definitely, the other two panelists do join in. Okay, but I do actually, I think I can say about this from the policy kind of perspective. We have done, kind of consistent analysis of official policies about the green BRI in high quality development under actually BRI. So there is one differences between the current recent actually GBRI policies and the previous one. In addition to the focus on environmental sustainability, financial sustainability was very much emphasized. I think this was actually one of the keywords in the white paper on BRI recently issued. So I don't think China actually is fully responsible for the financial stability of the host countries, and because China actually insists upon the non-intervention diplomacy, right? So this actually would put some constraints, institutional constraints on to what extent China would intervene into the local governance or actually the financial stability of the host countries. But China, at the moment, at least on policy level, do have an intention actually to make sure that the investment is sustainable, the money will be well used. We follow certain regulation on environmental protections, but on other actually local regulations as well. But whether the host country can really actually stand on their own foot and then run the projects, in a very long-term and sustainable way. This actually, I think, is contingent upon a lot of factors beyond China's, control. But I think Beijing does have the intention. There is, policy announcement on this already. But I think on the implementation level, it is actually a contingent upon a lot of factors, and the non-intervention policy diplomacy will really actually constrain China's levels of intervention.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very, very helpful. Hussain, I want to pull you in on that, not from the context of that China should interfere, but China should, help them to develop that backbone. And there's a beautiful case in some of your work that, Oil for Food program, which we know the results and the famous interview of Madeleine Albright, versus Oil for Reconstruction program in Iraq, that, it was 15% of the revenues from the oil and 85% as a soft loans from China. So can you elaborate on some of those dynamics and how in this context China can be not only an infrastructure developer, but a custodian or a mentor, for lack of a better word, of how these countries...
I think I would use I would use the term enabler, empowers. It empowers nations to leverage their interests. This concept you mentioned is very, very key in my research on how the nations can leverage their resources, natural resources, financial resources, to contribute to the building, not only China. And this was an agreement between Iraq and China signed in 2019, whereby China buys 1 million barrels of oil from Iraq every day. So the brilliant idea of the Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi, who was the oil minister before, is to take 10%, 100,000 barrels of oil, the money from that, to put it in a fund where Iraq contributes 15%, Chinese banks, with the support of Sinosure, puts in the rest of 85% to finance infrastructure projects in Iraq and industrial projects in Iraq. And Iraq will pay back, mechanically every day back these loans over a period of 20 years, and they can increase the fund. So this is a very easy way to finance infrastructure where the country does not really need to borrow money, but uses its raw oil to finance these projects, but it needs the Chinese counterpart to guarantee the loans which the Chinese companies will use in Iraq. In 2022 on the same, by the way, this was sabotaged by the United States. The Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi was overthrown a few months after he returned from Beijing. There's a long story behind that. I met him personally. In 2022, I met the Iraqi Prime Minister when he was just was in office. And they asked me for my opinion. I proposed to build a national development bank in Iraq using 5% of the oil revenues as deposit, as capital, to finance industrial, agricultural, and even infrastructure projects. And this was modeled on the actually Korean Development Bank from the 1950s and 60s. So the countries in Africa, in Asia, they can leverage their own resources to create finances to build in the infrastructure, to industry, and agriculture, and so on. So there are many creative ways of getting that done.
I'm happy Mukhtar is back as well. Can you take 30 seconds, Hussain, and elaborate on how still to this day the Iraqi oil money is being parked in the United States, and Iraq has to still ask for the blessings of America, even if it wants to buy, I don't know, Alstom or Siemens gas turbines. And that brings me back to Mukhtar and that conversation around the agency of the capital and the freedom of the capital. Can both of you weave into that a bit?
Yeah, the reason the Iraqi government cannot follow my idea is because they don't control the oil money. Because in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq and became the occupation power, it became responsible for all Iraqi resources. In May 22, United Nations resolution was passed, 1483, which was proposed by the United States to create the Iraqi Development Fund. The same day in the afternoon, President George W. Bush signed Executive Order 13033, which is called the Protection of the Iraqi Development Fund and Other Assets in which Iraq has interest. So the American president, he became the custodian of all Iraqi oil money up to today. So when the Chinese buy oil from Iraq, 1 million barrels every day, they don't pay Iraq. They pay to a bank account in the Federal Reserve in New York, which is under the control of the American president. And then the Americans decide how the Iraqis use the money. Many people don't believe the story when I tell them. Therefore, I did research and I wrote articles about it, how the United States controls every dollar of Iraqi oil money until today.
Mukhtar, you want to weave into that? And what are the safeguards for the GCC oil and gas money sitting in the United States, or this new commitments of late? And how will that contrast in terms of attractiveness if some of these funds find their ways in co-investments even with China instead? I think, Mukhtar, your connection is frozen. We'll come back to you. But I will go to Zhang, and I want to ask you a simple question. If you were to... Mukhtar, I think we're having a patchy connection from you. Did you hear my question?
Go ahead.
Did you hear my question? And did you hear Hussain's comments or not?
Yes, I heard Hussein's comments, and I'm just waiting for your question.
So my question is that in light of that and what Hussain just so eloquently painted and so surprisingly and shockingly for many of us, how would GCC states feel like, having seen some of these dynamics in terms of the flow of their capital and the safety of their capital, if Iraq today, 22 years late, still cannot access its own fundings from its oil revenues from United States based on an executive order? So if, you know, we live in a very crazy world, what is the security of capital in the Western Hemisphere today? And how can the GCC diversify to be part and parcel of economic growth within BRI next to China by not rattling the, how do you say, the boat as such?
Well, look, I think there's no simple answer to that question, Ali. I think the reality is that trade has to be denominated in a multi-currency world so that you're not reliant on
Mukhtar, your connection is very patchy. Would you kindly disconnect and reconnect? Mukhtar, we can hardly hear you. I will go to Zhang in the meantime while you find a better connection. Zhang, I was about to ask you this question when Mukhtar arrived. In light of the developments of Belt and Road, the Green Belt and Road, as a scholar, as a researcher, fully impartial, what would be the score of Green BRI and what are the areas of improvement in your opinion, briefly?
It is getting better with the engagements of private sector. The engagements of private sector, I think, is important in the sense that it actually has a lot more accountability.
Recording in progress.
It also actually would, I think, materialize more expected outputs in reality. So that actually would also contribute to actually the financial sustainability we were talking about before. So we have seen actually, great improvements on the implementation of the Green BRI post-COVID in actually, currently. So this actually, I think, before perhaps low at 5, and now I would actually give score more than 5 and hopefully, get higher score. And I think this is also a project, where a lot of countries can share common interest on climate issue and environmental issues. Here, well, people will say it is non-strategic area, so hopefully, less competition, less geopolitical conflicts. So perhaps here, hopefully China can have a lot more, outsiders involved as well in the future, in addition to BRI countries. So I think, yeah, it's hopeful.
Well, I think if I were to judge anybody and needed a fair assessment, I would call Zhang as well. That 5.5, 5.5 is very, very sober, very humble, but I'm sure people on the recipient end would say a little bit higher, but that's fine. We take it from you at 5.5. Mukhtar, my question, just very briefly, because I want to bring our session into a conclusion with your help and that of Hussain and Zhang. My question was that Hussain so eloquently shocked us at what's happening with the Iraqi oil, and most of our audience, I knew about it because I've read his great work. What are the safeguards for the GCC in this dance of 7 veils and the protection of their assets? I mean, from a military power, it's not like they're stronger than Russia, I'm afraid to say. From a fiscal power, it's not like they have any repercussions as such. And, how will they do this dance and how can they diversify into going in collaboration with China in some of these developments? And I want to bring Hussain very briefly as well. You wrote about this Operation Felix, Hussain, long time ago, and it was a vision similar to your ambitions for Iraq in Yemen. But what we're seeing is that at the moment, this very elements of the ports and the pieces of the puzzle are being shattered or thrown, upside down, which weaves again back into the Bab al-Mandab, the passage of tears. Are we going to see more tears in West Asia, the two of you? Whether it's fiscal or geopolitical tears. So
Mukhtar can start, yes.
Mukhtar,
Well,
go
look, I mean, I think to your earlier question, I think the only thing that the GCC countries can do is use the instruments that are available to them. Okay? Not everything has to be funded in one currency, whatever currency that is. I mean, diversification is a mantra of the financial market. So the ability to fund assets that are managed offshore can be done in multiple currencies, in multiple locations, and it would be wise to do so. Secondly, as these countries, i.e. the GCC, accrue RMB or value in other currencies, then they have to be able to deploy that somewhere. And I think that creates a level of financial maturity that gives them the ability to mitigate what I would call expropriation risk, which is really what's happened elsewhere. Can you completely eliminate expropriation? No. But can you choose how you manage that risk? Yes. And that's through diversification, both geographically and by instrument and by tenor. So, that would be the way the financial markets would look at it.
Hussain?
Yeah, I really support this idea of diversification of currencies in trade, but also making the trade in oil and gas and other commodities very, very long term, like 25 years, 50 years contracts, not to be based on the daily fluctuations of which hurts both sides. So, but concerning the Yemeni plan, I did this research in 2018 together with the Yemeni Investment Authority. They asked me to present ideas about if there is peace in Yemen, how it could be rebuilt. And the basic idea is to use my knowledge in physical economics, not financial economics, to see how to unify the whole country's physical resources, human, geographical, water, minerals, and of course, its geographical location. And because of the geographical location of Yemen, it has been subject to geopolitical games, where the country is being split, where some countries and some powers want to control the Aden port, others want to control the Hodeidah port, and so on and so forth. But my idea is that through using economics, we can both unify the country to avoid civil war, but also turn Yemen into a bridge rather than a wall and a threat by building infrastructure from Iran to Oman through Yemen to Africa, and then from Yemen northward to Saudi Arabia. So to unify the country with infrastructure domestically, but connecting it to the neighboring countries and becoming a bridge between Africa and Asia. So that was the idea. And I think the Chinese support these kinds of ideas, but they cannot find solutions for the geopolitical problem, which its source comes from somewhere else. And I think the Saudis and the Arabs have realized that they cannot solve the problem in Yemen through military means. The United States realized that recently. You cannot defeat the Yemenis with the weapons. So there should be a different way of incorporating Yemen into a more peaceful process. But as I said, there is no peace without economic development. And the Belt and Road Initiative is the name for that.
Now, I want each of you to take 1.5 minutes to bring your thoughts together. You can use it that way, or if you have any burning questions for any of your fellow panelists, you can ask that question. So either you go about for using this 1.5 minutes, and please be tight with it in the spirit of our next speakers, or ask a question from your fellow panelists. So your choice. Zain, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you. So since I focus on the green development under BRI, and there has been these concerns about China is using this green development as strategic to expand its influence in Global South in competition with the US. Well, of course, you can't find such narrative in policy, right? Openly. But what do you guys think about this kind of assessment?
Hussain and Mukhtar, very short.
I would appreciate.
Shall I start first?
Yes,
yeah,
please,
well,
go ahead.
I think that I'm very, very optimistic about the future prospects for the Belt and Road Initiative because of the dynamic change which is taking place in the world. There are big threats to our civilization, as we've seen recently. Even the Ukraine war can develop into a global war, thermonuclear weapon. Everyone talking about nuclear wars. But there is a different way to go. And I hope, and that's why we are active in Sweden, because we want to convince the EU and even the United States to work with China instead of working against China on the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, I would like to ask Mukhtar on the question of diversifying the financial resources, but to leverage the local financial resources, because there's a lot of financial resources in the global South. There are thousands of centimillionaires in the global South now, and billionaires, and in China, in ASEAN, and even in the Gulf countries and Africa, there is enormous financial wealth which is not being used for this development process.
Mukhtar, briefly, thank you.
Look, briefly on the first question, my simple answer, and it may sound very simple, is that let's distinguish between rhetoric and reality. Okay? If we manage by rhetoric, we won't get very far because people will always complain about something, somebody, somewhere. I think if we manage by reality, which is more green projects come out more continuously, which show more progress for more countries more frequently, that's it. Effectively, the question is answered. And that's the way I would go about it, because I think once you get caught in a rhetoric game, it never ends. Hussain, to your question, I think one of the great unutilized pools of liquidity in the global South is domestic currencies, domestic finance. We have reasonably sophisticated banking systems. There is a lot of liquidity, but the ability to deploy that liquidity, the ability to use it constructively, those channels and mechanisms haven't been created. We many years ago did a transaction in Indonesia where we were trying to convince the then Minister of Finance that there was an awful lot of people who wanted to invest via a certain instrument. And when they issued a sovereign bond, why don't they just create a retail component? That was sensationally successful because suddenly a lot of money came out from under the mattress. And I think many of these countries in the global South, that there's an opportunity to think, how do we incorporate local currency as part of the kind of cocktail mix of financing that is needed domestically? And then how does that flip over into providing, let's say, an earning stream for pension funds, okay, where you've got people who are saving and need a yield. So bringing those two components together would help a great deal. And there's a lot of work to be done on this.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you. That's great.
Thank you so much to all of our audience who joined us to begin with. I personally sincerely believe that when great distances cannot hinder the minds that seek harmony. And what I found today in our call was a lot of harmony from different areas of expertise. So I like to thank our audience. I like to thank you, the panel, Zain, Hussain, Mukhtar. I also like to thank Chandran and Gift for continuing to give the gift of dialogue. There's one thing to be the gift, there's another thing to give the gift of dialogue to all of us and coming together. We were very proud to partner with Gift on this initiative at BRI Dialogues and Al-Sabah program and 360. But I would like to say that, Marco Polo said famously, I haven't told the half of what I saw when he came back from the Silk Road. I haven't told the half of what I saw. I believe we haven't seen even a quarter of what BRI can bring to the Global South. And for that matter, may Gift and the wonderful team of Chandran and his colleagues bring us together for harmonious discussions and monitoring this trajectory of the Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you so much for such a wonderful conclusion speech. for panel 2. And thank you, Mr. Hussain, Mr. Asghari, Dr. Wu, for such an insightful discussion on the future of the BRI. In the context of finance, the diversification of currencies, green BRI, the Middle East, etc., it is clear that more countries could stand to benefit in the future, and that the BRI could also be one of the roads to peace. Now, to round off the day, I would like to invite our closing keynote speaker, Professor Rana Mitter from Harvard Kennedy School. There will be a brief Q&A session after his speech, so don't forget to post your questions in the Q&A box below. I would like to hand over to Chandran to introduce Professor Mitter. Over to you, Chandran.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you to everyone who's joined us so far. I'm going to keep this brief. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Rana Mitter. If you haven't heard of him, I don't know where you've been, but Professor Rana Mitter is a professor of U.S.-China relations at Harvard. Prior to that, he taught at Oxford. And I would very strongly recommend her book of 2013, I think, Professor Mitter, on the Forgotten Ally, China, World War II, which I believe was published in 2013, the year the BRI was launched. And Professor Mitter is a very sought-after commentator on issues of geopolitical significance, but bringing history to bear on all of these things. So Professor Mitter's got a hard stop, so I'm going to shut up and hand over to him. And I know a lot of my friends have just texted me, say, can't wait to hear him speak. So Professor Mitter, thank you for coming on board, and we are delighted to have you. Over to you. Thank you.
Chandran, thank you very much indeed for that very warm welcome. And hello to everyone, I think, from a whole variety of continents and places today. I'm going to assume that the tech is working and you can hear me clearly. You'll let me know, I'm sure, on the tech side. Thumbs up there from Chandran, so that sounds great. What I'd like to do is to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then, as Liana, I think your host said, there is going to be a little time for some Q&A. We're going to come up to the hour, but there's certainly time, I hope, for people to ask some questions and give their thoughts. And I'm aware that you've spent most of the day hearing a variety of very expert panelists talking about the BRI in a broader sense, where it's going, how financing is changing, what it means in terms of a whole variety of different economic and geopolitical issues. So I thought the most useful thing I could do in terms of a short closing set of thoughts was to, as someone has said already, bring in history a little bit in terms of some of the context, but also flag up what I think are perhaps three areas in the future, perhaps the quite near future into the early 2030s, where I think the question of where the BRI goes will be debated most significantly, both in terms of ways in which it would develop, but also potential obstacles, which I think it's worth us keeping in mind as we close out today's session. Let me say, first of all, Chandran, you were kind enough to mention a book I read or published 10 years ago, which slightly more than 10 years ago, actually, now, I suppose, yes, 2013, 12 years ago, on the history of China in World War II. And I'm particularly put in mind of that because, as many on this call will know, this summer actually, is the 80th anniversary of the ending of World War II in Asia, which included, of course, the Sino-Japanese War, the War of Resistance, as it's known in China, as a very important constituent part, along with the Pacific War, which tends to be perhaps a little bit more familiar in the Western imagination. The reason I bring that up at the start, apart, of course, from the issues that of the anniversary, which I think are worth remembering. And indeed, if you don't know the history, I'd encourage you to read widely and find out about it. But also because it's a reminder of something a little disturbing, but worth remembering so that we can avoid, I think, what would be one of the great disasters, which is that wartime history was a time when Asia was not at peace. And because Asia has been essentially, at least in international terms, a pretty peaceful continent overall, really since 1979. The Sino-Vietnamese War was the last international conflict that really operated across borders in this region. Because of that, we have maybe come to believe that it's the natural state of Asia to be simply a place that's automatically peaceful. And we look at Ukraine, we look at the Middle East and think, well, goodness me, it's great that that's not happening in Asia. But there's nothing natural about that. It is something that has to be thought about carefully, and structures and geopolitics and geoeconomics have to come together in a way that maintains that peace in Asia. So I think that's a very important collective task. And it's not just a task for Asians. It is a task for the whole world, not least because Asia is, and I think will continue to be economically, one of the most vibrant and dynamic parts of the globe, therefore central to debates about what happens to BRI and other economic groupings that exist in the region. But peace, I would say, is a really important prerequisite in terms of how that future is likely to unfold. So remembering that very turbulent warlike past that Asia has had, certainly just about within living memory when we think about World War II, is a salutary reminder that the situation we have today is not a given. It needs to be thought about, it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be curated. So bearing that in mind, let me bring in one other historical element that I'd like to bear in mind in terms of the context of how we might think about the BRI and the story of the Global South, which has been so much, I know, a thread through what you've been talking about today, and which will continue, of course, to be an absolutely central part to these debates for years, possibly decades to come. And that's the question of the history of energy. Now, you could actually argue that in part, World War II in Asia was, amongst other things, a war that broke out because of energy supplies. And I'm thinking here of the embargo the United States placed on the imperial Japanese state, which wanted oil and other resources from various parts of Asia, was prevented by the United States action from getting them, and eventually launched Pearl Harbor. Now, I hope we're a very, very long way away from those horrific events, but it's worth remembering that energy supply and its consequences do have a history. Perhaps in a less confrontational way, it's worth remembering that a significant part of the history of the post-war period was also tied up with energy. For a very long time, the question of who had control over the world's most powerful source of grounding for energy, in other words, in the Middle East, was an absolutely central part of geopolitics. Of course, the religious, political, and other conflicts that roiled the Middle East, continue to do so, of course, over decades, have a great deal to do with religion, with politics, with nationalism, but they also had to do with energy. And remembering that debates over oil prices and the question of supply from the Middle East, which are not absent today, was central to the politics of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, is a reminder that something that often seems in the background actually has to be thought of in the foreground. It even infects, perhaps infects is not the right word, but it even informs, perhaps is the better way to put it, informs moral narrative. Think back to the 1980s when there was a contrast perhaps with automobiles made in Europe or in the West in general, which were considered to be gas guzzling, as opposed to the Japanese models which were coming onto the market, which had a much more frugal use of gasoline, petrol, fossil fuels. And again, even those terms guzzling versus frugal have a sort of moral weight attached to them, reminding us that even when we talk about seemingly economic issues such as energy supply, moral issues and values are never far away from how they're defined. So that leads me to make a few comments about the way in which I see perhaps some of the key issues that will shape some of these debates and more in the next few years. And as I say, I mean by that into the 2030s, and I think possibly even beyond. And energy certainly sits at the heart of those, but it's not the only one. So thinking about BRI, which of course in some ways is also morphing into the wider GDI, the Global Development Initiative. We don't yet know enough about quite where that's going, but we'll be no doubt learning more in the near future. And tying that up to the bigger story that's run, I know, through today, which is how The economies of Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America are growing, developing, and finding voices of their own, which are not simply going to be dominated by the desires of today's superpowers, whether military or economic, the United States, the European Union, and of course, China, with India, of course, also playing an intriguing role in this new global order. I think these big states will be very important, but they're not, I think, going to be dominant in terms of global South language and discourses. There's a lot more agency, particularly in the many countries of the global South, which have their own emerging middle classes. They have their own developing industries, service sectors, and also wider visions of how they want societies to be, which are not simply shaped by what Beijing wants, what Washington wants, or indeed what Brussels wants. So what are some of the underpinnings that I think the BRI will become part of the debate on? Indeed, it's already part of the debate, but it will be part of a developing and changing debate. Well, let's start with energy for the first one. And again, you've heard a great deal about that today, I'm aware. But I think the way in which, particularly in the last half year or so, it does seem that we're moving, at least for the near future, into a world where there's a significant divergence in terms of not just energy supply, but what you might call the philosophy of energy. In other words, a reversion, particularly in the United States, towards pushing to the use of fossil fuel resources. And again, LNG and other factors in terms of global supply are going to be important there, along with a much stronger stress on US fuel self-sufficiency in terms of how the economy is going to develop in the next few years. It leads to a dilemma for Europe, of course, which is much less fuel self-sufficient, and the question of what happens in terms of moving past the supply of Russian fossil fuels, something that's unlikely ever to return to the situation it was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and then, of course, more full scale in 2022. But also beyond that, the now undoubted leading place that Chinese technology has in terms of key aspects of post-fossil fuel green tech when it comes to energy. Solar panels, of course, being an important part of that, wind turbine technology, and of course nuclear, which still remains a very important element in the way in which that energy story is going to be told in the near future. Now, we'll get in a moment to some other aspects of tech, but as I suspect that probably one of your speakers will have pointed out earlier in the day, and I'll just mention it now, the nature of why hunger for energy will change is already in front of us. And I'm thinking here of the issue of the high energy hunger of the need for big data. In other words, the production of essentially data farms, which are going to draw in huge amounts of demand for energy in shaping AI and the other technologies that already are beginning to change labor markets and economies around the world. So far, there is still only, I think, a relatively patchwork, relatively tentative set of stories around how that energy need is going to be provided and is meaningfully compatible with the reality of the need for post-fossil fuel, climate change-friendly energy technology. Advances are being made, and many of them are, of course, coming from technologies within China, as I think is well known. But that's not the only place, of course, where they're emerging. I've mentioned the continuing and changing role of India in global society, and the question of how far in terms of energy tech India has advantages in terms of production and scalability, I think will become one of the very, very key questions, not right now, but certainly in the near future. And that says something, I think, about the centrality of energy debates that are going to be going on and deepening and broadening in the next few years. So that particular element where right now, in the moment that we're at, China certainly has a leading position in terms of that technology. One of the debates we're going to go through is this now path dependency, or are there other players who are willing to come into that market, put in the R&D, put in the scalability and make and produce more of a diversity in terms of the capacity to supply those sorts of goods. One of the things that we do know, I think still from classic market economics, is that monopoly providers of goods, even if they're public goods, are generally inclined to end up in a monopoly position. Prices raised, or indeed restrictions put forward in terms of the availability of those technologies dependent on political behavior. One of the best pushbacks against the possibility of any country getting that kind of monopoly position is actually for the global system to encourage diversity of production. And while India is by no means the only player, I think it's fair to say that we can look at the importance of it as a potential player amongst others in terms of how that energy story develops. The second factor I want to bring up also links to technology, and that's more to do with comms and technology infrastructure. And right at this moment, as I think is well known, there is a huge advantage that China has in terms of cost, speed, and scalability when it comes to the production of infrastructure that underpins 5G and what comes next, particularly Internet of Things. And of course, the structure, once again, for those fast changing and not yet fully predictable AI-driven changes that we will expect in the global economy and the emerging economies of the world in the next few years. Again, you'll have had it talked about, I'm sure, during the day, so I don't need to stress the point. But if we think about the way in which e-commerce has been developing, and certainly China in terms of scalability and efficiency is an extraordinary example of how far you can go in a very short time when it comes to e-commerce. And again, think of the B2B type providers who sit in the back rooms in China, who are all part of that wider infrastructure and something that the wider global economy is still, I think, in the stage of developing. Certainly what China's managed to do there remains a very important part of understanding how the global economy might develop. But nonetheless, there's still a great deal of transformation. And the key questions which underpin the growth and capacity of communications infrastructure to deal with AI and other developments in the West and the rest of the global South and in China remain partly unanswered. I would say that one of the big unanswered questions, and this is a challenge for China, but it's a challenge for the West as well, and it's a challenge actually for every emerging economy, is AI, at least in the forms that we seem to see it emerging in transforming global economy in the next few years, provides efficiency, it provides scale, it provides all sorts of capacity that simply we couldn't have imagined even a few years ago. But does it provide jobs? Because in the end, one of the great discontents that is happening in economies around the world, you can see it in the United States, you can see it in the industrialized economies of Western Europe, and you can see it in China, where underemployment, the inability of some of the smartest young graduates from Beijing and Shanghai to find jobs that essentially match their talents, the fact that we have, very, very patchy statistics in terms of what's happening in terms of underemployment, again, a sign that all is not well there. These are real factors. And when one asks questions in Beijing, in Washington, in Brussels about what the solution is going to be, quite often the fallback is a highly technocratic one about the way in which AI and other technological capacities are going to change the labor market. But pressing down harder, and again, maybe the Q&A is the place for this, it's often hard to get a straight answer about where exactly these jobs are coming from. In other words, the threat that AI is coming for your job is a real one across the world, whether it's China, whether it's the US, whether it's the EU, and the answers that those who are in charge of the technology, its rollout, and its capacity need to come up with will be a very, very important part of knowing whether populations around the world consider that technological rollout to be an advantage, something that helps to improve societies in the next few years, or whether it's seen as immensely destructive of much of the nature of human civilization. I don't claim to have the answers to these questions, but I think they're important ones to answer, and vague answers that the jobs will come from somewhere, that the fulfillment that human beings need in terms of having that kind of role in society, in which in many cases are being taken away by AI, will be replaced by something else, need more specific and more granular answers than they've been given. Otherwise, the many very turbulent changes in global geopolitics that we can see at the moment are unlikely, I think, to slow down. Let me mention one other turbulence where, again, I think aspects of BRI and its wider economic significance will be important, are in terms of global health. We're now 5 years out from the pandemic, and there is a danger, as the world tends to do, of forgetting an experience that was actually not that long ago, and certainly massively destructive, not just to the global economy, but also, of course, to the normal flourishing of human existence, along with the many millions of deaths around the world that were caused by that pandemic. And forward thinking around how global health will essentially be maintained and developed in a world where emergent middle classes and growing economies will also demand an infrastructure that keeps people not just wealthy, but healthy as well. Pharmaceutical research, life sciences, and the capacity to spread out and bring that sort of technical capability to the wider world is potentially a very valuable contribution that BRI could be part of. And one of the ways in which that happens, and this can be uncomfortable for China, along with other countries, I think, other major countries such as the US, I think, is it involves spreading science elsewhere. In other words, the concentration of scientific capacity, which currently exists in the global north, in China, and a few other places, needs to spread further. We need more science in sub-Saharan Africa. We need more of it of the highest level in Southeast Asia. We need more of it in Latin America. There will still be hubs in those places. Perhaps Brazil comes to mind, Indonesia, Malaysia, and other places. But China and the Western world are going to have to get together and make sure that that scientific capability in areas like life sciences is not hoarded, is not kept, as it were, as the domain or the empire of any one of our leading powers, whether it's Beijing or Washington or Brussels, but rather that the benefits of that type of scientific research are felt more widely because it can be done at a base level around the world and not simply exported with the patents jealously held on to in a way that does not provide that kind of wider capacity for scientific development. That's a challenge, and it's a challenge that, as I say, I think will be hard for some of the major powers to actually embrace, but I think it's necessary in terms of where the next set of challenges lie. I'll use that thought, if I may, to essentially summarize what I think is likely to happen in the near future and where the challenge lies. And then let's have the last few minutes or so for a bit of Q&A, which I'm sure Chandran and others will organize. I think that the Global South, it sounds to me, is a driver of the conversation that you've been having today. And while I haven't been able to hear most of the conference, I've heard some of it. I hope that people will go away with something that strikes me as key, which is that the era in which major powers, the United States, the EU, and China is a major power these days, are essentially in a position to tell others what to do, that needs to be over. And I think that it is steadily becoming a worldview of the past rather than of the future. Instead, learning about genuine partnership. And actually, again, there was a speaker in the previous panel who made a really good point I'd like to repeat, steal, if I may, but with acknowledgement, which is the difference between rhetoric and reality. One of the things that we know is that great powers, the United States, China, the EU, are very good on rhetoric. It's a common fault to all of them, whether it's talking about partnership through strength, whether it's talking about communities of common destiny, whether it's talking about, what it might be a European future, which might be defined as differently from that elsewhere. What I think people want to know is, first of all, how the granular outcome is going to be in all these cases. And secondly, real leaders and real societies understand complexity. They're not afraid of it. What they are afraid of, I think, is people who come bearing saccharine messages, which often hide behind them a much more, how can one put it, less generous reality. I think talking about cooperation is easy. Doing it is hard, but it can be done if it is done in the spirit of sincerity and understanding that both sides have to both take and give. That's a challenge, I think, for a very turbulent global system that we have been moving into for some time and will be with us for some time to come. But there are also indications, not least in terms of how those questions of energy, technology, data, AI may change us in the next few years, that suggests it's a challenge that all societies should be willing to embrace and take up. And I hope very much your conference today has been part of that conversation. It's been a great pleasure to be with you today. And Chandran, if I might hand over to you. We have some time now for, I think, for a few comments or questions.
Professor Mehta, that was how to say a whole lot of stuff in 20 minutes. You covered as a masterclass of delivering a worldview with a focus on the whole issue of rising powers, historical perspectives, etc. So I know you've got a bit of a hard stop, and you tell me when you're ready to run away and teach, but I'll ask you a couple of questions that are coming through as well. You touched on energy.
Please.
You touched on energy, and then you said it's going to be more than energy because of the technology issues. Up to 10 years ago, we were told that the world energy needs would, increase by 50%, just because of the developing world's needs. And now we're hearing that data centers might account for 75% of new energy needs, etc. So in that sense, and given the power disparities, and coming back to BRI, I hope it's not an unfair question. What should China, in terms of in its attempt or its desired commitment to global good, do in terms of what the next 10 years should be for the developing countries where the BRI is, given the scenario you've painted, particularly in relation to energy and all the other materials that essentially the new energy sort of matrix will require?
It's a great question, Chandran. Thank you. Now, I would say that one of the things that is, just objectively the case at the moment is that in the vast majority, particularly of the kind of green tech areas, China has a dominant position in terms of the capacity, particularly for solar and wind. So I'm going to give a counterintuitive answer, but I think it's actually one that would work very well for Beijing. Whether or not they would take it is another matter, but I'll give you my thought.
They are listening. They're listening.
Are they? Hi, guys. This is spread the wealth. I think if you wanted to find a way to actually do what everyone has been talking about for 50 to 60 years and never managed, which is to find a way for India and China to work together, then actually providing the technology and setting up the spreading of the capacity for production of the key elements of green energy tech to India and to other actors in the global south would actually be the most impressive thing that China could do. Now, in one sense, it goes against Chinese instincts, because what China's done would say, look, we put all the money and time and R&D for years and years into becoming dominant in this position. Why on earth should we give it away? But actually, one of the principles of economics that's often least appreciated is that actually things are not zero sum. In other words, by China spreading its knowledge and its capacities so that it doesn't have pure and simple control over these technologies, it would actually gain a great deal more cooperation. It would gain competition, which actually would improve quality in China itself. And I think it would do a huge amount of good, actually, for China's global image. Just because the United States is going through a difficult time at the moment, and I think that's globally felt to be part of the new agenda, doesn't mean that China's reputation has risen. It means that people are willing to hear a story from China, but China so far is still playing a little bit the old playbook of, look, we're here, you come to us, and we control the proprietary stuff, but we'll hand it out to you if we feel that it's in our interest. That's what I meant by the difference between picking up on your other speak between rhetoric and reality. Sometimes the counterintuitive thing to do feels uncomfortable, but it ends up medium to long term with a much, much better result. The United States during the Cold War actually did itself a great deal of good over time by spending and spreading its capacities, often against its own immediate economic and geopolitical interests. It ended up, of course, finding a Cold War outcome that made the United States, at least for a while, a really important actor. I think we're not moving into a new Cold War scenario in that sort of case. I think there's going to be a lot of different multipolar powers that are powerful for quite some time to come. But I think going against its own instincts might actually be more productive for China than it realizes at the moment.
Wonderful. I got another question, but my experience in recent times working with Chinese companies like Huawei, etc., is that they, if I can put it crudely, want to spread the love, and they are not looking at essentially just profiteering. But you are right in saying there is an inbuilt instinct in all societies where people have technology to keep it for themselves and try and profiteer. But I get a sense that might be something different. I hope I'm right. And I think you hope I'm right too, because that's what the world needs. The second question that I wanted to ask you, and I think it's a really important one. I was so glad you mentioned India, and then you hinted at the China-India relations. I was in India in February, and I suggested to various Indian think tanks I was speaking to that the China-India relationship would probably be the most consequential for the 21st century, thinking outside the box, given the populations and all of that. I got a lot of pushback, and you probably know why, but do you think that is unrealistic to expect? And I know from both sides, there are strong elements believing that it is very important. At this stage, probably India needs a bit, I can't say this, India probably needs China a bit more, but it'd be hugely beneficial. So as a historian, someone looking forward, is that relationship probably the defining relationship without understating the importance of the United States, EU, but in terms of the world and the population, the reality that we're faced with, two countries, about 3 billion people in total. Is that the most important? And what should be done?
It's definitely one of the most important, Chandran. I think that's not in doubt. And if you think about what's similar and different between the two, you can see complementarities. I mean, India still relatively has a quite young demographic, as opposed to China, which now famously is moving into a new phase where the demographic will be older in all sorts of ways. India still, I think, when it comes to the service provision and also an awful lot of the maintenance that goes on around the IT for services, has clearly developed into an absolute global player for a variety of reasons, not least concerns about security. Let's be frank about it. There are a lot of players who won't go into China for that particular reason, and that's just, realistic. So all of those things, I think, provide a variety of reasons. I think you're right for the moment in terms of the trade imbalance between the two. It's very much in China's favor at the moment. I think finding areas where it's realistic to find areas of cooperation is really the key thing. Now, we haven't mentioned it, so let's just be upfront about it. The major issue probably continues to be the border dispute in the Himalayas. You speak to people on the Indian side, you speak to people on the Chinese side, and they will both give lengthy and impassioned accounts of why they're exactly right about everything and the other side is wrong about everything else. These are not always very productive conversations. But the wider issue around that is that you have there two of the major economies in not just the region, but the world. The Indian economy, despite drawbacks, for instance, the fact that India is not fully integrated into its region in terms of economics after the South Asia free trade agreements are not really, I think, very effective because for political reasons, Pakistan and other neighbors are not natural trading partners for India. But nonetheless, there is a wider capacity, I think, in both cases for there to be discussions, as particularly, I'm going to put forward energy again as an area in which clearly there's massive hunger. There's going to be massive needs as those middle classes develop. And to some extent, I think it's almost going to become an unavoidable question, which forces people into thinking how to be more creative about those sorts of issues. So I'd say certainly in the 2030s, stay tuned for some possibly interesting new developments in that particular area. I think we've got time to fit in one more if you'd like to, Chandran.
Yes, thank you. So we had someone from Pakistan and talk and gave us insights that most of us never hear about in terms of the benefits of the BRI, etc. The Chinese BRI in Pakistan raises temperatures in India, as you well know. But so I thought, again, looking into 30 years, Pakistan is a very important country. You know that better than I do in terms of size, scale, and its geopolitical positioning, etc. And as you've said so eloquently, we need peace through development as a prerequisite for stability and development. And it's both, it's chicken and egg. You have to have that. So can you just say, what do you think that relationship with China and Pakistan, which is quite strong through a BRI, is essential for Pakistan, which is a very important nation? And then how does China and India and that whole area, which if you put the three countries together, you got 3.3 billion people or something like that by 2050. So I really appreciate your comment on that one.
Sure. So I would give you one particular case study, which I think will be well known to people who know the region, Pakistan and India in particular, which is the Indus Valley Accords, signed in 1960 about, the provision of shared use of 6 rivers, essentially divided between the two sides. Until this year, and, the recent horrific developments earlier this year between India and Pakistan, perhaps has been the first case when it looks as if that particular agreement may not have stuck, although I think it's still in flux in some ways. The wider history does demonstrate that even through conflicts, wars, and so forth, that particular resource management agreement has stuck between the two sides. And I think that does show that the capacity is there to understand how underlying commonalities mean that there are things that bring people together as well as take them apart. The political division, which everyone on this call is going to know, obviously, from 1947 onwards, have shaped the subcontinent in certain ways that have been vociferous, centripetal, pushing people apart. The underlying ecological and economic logics of the whole of the whole region do point in a very different sort of direction. And as that particular part of history, I mean, it still seems to be in some ways, current affairs as much as history, but as the realization that these resource questions will become more urgent, and as you say, as countries like Pakistan, also Bangladesh, which you mentioned on the other side too, one of the largest and fastest growing economies in the world, become more significant players in the most populous region in the world, I think some of those resource questions are going to actually force all sides to get together to come to new sorts of agreements. And China, of course, I imagine will be a very important part of those discussions too. But to some extent, I think what we're talking about here is probably what you might call home business amongst people in the South Asia space as well, with China, of course, an important element of a wider conversation.
Professor Mehta, really, I can't thank you enough. Just 30 minutes, you've enabled us to see things and envision possibilities, threats, etc., and make sense of a very turbulent world, but in which there's a great amount of prospects, and particularly to remind us of the importance of remembering history, and particularly in Asia, not taking things for granted. I come from Southeast Asia, and I always say we've been lucky. 50 years since the Vietnam War. I was born during that period. I grew up always being mindful that we had the domino theory and all of that. We were all frightened that the commies were all coming, and we've had peace, and not to take it for granted. So I would love to engage you more, but I know you've got to run, and we will be back if you will have us invite you again to share your deep insights with all of us. So thank you so much for being with us, and I think on behalf of everyone who stayed on, we're extremely grateful. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, everyone, and have a great end of conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you. So with that, everyone, I'd like to hand back to my colleague, Liana, who will sort of make some closing remarks and guide you to sort of actions with regard to the webinar and the video that will be made available, because a lot of people could not attend, or if you want to share it with your friends. Over to you, Liana. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Mukhtar and Chandran, for ending this conference on a high note. This marks the end of today's conference, which is the first of our three-part series, Shattering Paradigms, China and the World. I'm pleased to announce to you that you can also register for our second conference, Geopolitics and Conflicts. It's China's Balancing Act, a Global Good, happening in 2 months' time on Thursday, 11th of September. The registration link will be shared in the chat box. Before you leave, we would like to remind everyone that this conference recording will be shared on GIF's YouTube page and GIF's LinkedIn account and also the event website. We are also pleased to share that GIF issues a monthly newsletter that offers our latest insights, programs, events, and reports. We also have the second newsletter called Tomorrow Matters, which features curated articles from local writers in Asia on a range of topics such as local and regional politics, economics, history, and culture. You can subscribe to our free newsletter on our website via the link in the chat box below. Finally, please give us your feedback on today's conference via the post-event survey that will automatically pop up after the session ends. Thank you again for attending, and we hope to see you soon.
Everyone, thank you. Okay.